Good evening. So, yesterday, on the 29th, I got involved in a conversation revolving around a poll that was put up on Facebook. Now, the poll was with regards to Centerlink and whether it pays enough or whether it's adequate for all the participants on Centerlink. Whether it was capable of supporting them, giving them a reasonable expectation on being able to fulfill what they need to do in their day-to-day lives. Now, to explain, yesterday on my Facebook feed, one of my friends had commented, which of course drew my attention to the particular poll that was on a Facebook page, which you can see in front of you now, which is for a current affair, which is a local current affair show here in Australia. Now you can see at the top, the poll says Skye and Harley are young Australians who rely on welfare to get by. Both say their payments are stretched too thin and that the requirements are tough. Now that seems pretty fair to me. It's a simple poll about the circumstances surrounding the payments of Centerlink. Now, the particular comment from my friend that caught my eye, you can probably see now on your screen, says, "Here's a novel idea to get more money. Get a job. No jobs in the area? Move somewhere so you can get a job." Now, that doesn't sound too unreasonable, as it is. I mean, okay, so, these people are finding it hard to get by on Centerlink, to deal with everyday expenses, those sorts of things. Sure, get a job, The thing that bothered me most about this comment wasn't so much the get a job thing. That's pretty common. Everyone sort of that you see that respond to these sorts of things either fall into two camps. Those who understand the reality of the situation, or those that just want to fall back on blanket claims, which is get a job. Like it's somehow the fault of every participant of unemployment benefits that they are choosing not to try and get a job. What bothered me most about this was the simple statement, move somewhere so you can get a job. Now you can see that I responded to this directly underneath, right here. I said, just wondering if you are volunteering to pay the expenses needed for those that have no money to move, such as transport, rent, bond, school fees. As I'm not familiar with any job that pays a wage before you start, or any bank that offers a loan without a job. Now I thought, it's a pretty reasonable thing to ask. Obviously, I'm trying to point out the lunacy of the situation because I'm specifically saying, is he going to volunteer to pay for those expenses? I know he's not, right? I'm not expecting anyone to. I'm just being facetious and putting that point forward, that the money has to come from somewhere, and that in my experience, and I'm certainly this is the case for anyone who has ever been unemployed, no job will pay you a wage before you start the job. To the best of my understanding, there has been no job within Australia or Queensland that is likely to pay you 2 weeks work in advance before you have even done a single day, unless you've signed a contract and there's some sort of guarantee that you will complete that work. There is not a single job I know of that will do that. Now, I might be wrong, and if I am wrong, I'd be very curious to hear what jobs those are, and maybe you'd like to put that down in the comments. The other thing I know of from personal experience is that no bank that I'm aware of within Australia, and I'll even go so far as to say no commercial entity, no financial commercial entity within Australia, bank, credit union, anything like that, will offer you a loan without you having a job. Now that's understandable. It's frustrating. It's certainly frustrating. I've been in situations where I have been unemployed. Having the capacity to get a loan to allow me to get a car or something like that would certainly have helped in my job seeking prospects. But, I also understand that there's an element of responsibility there. The banks have to make the presumption that because you are not working, that you're incapable of paying back the loan. And while for myself I knew that I could, and I had worked all that out at those particular times, they don't know that. I'm a number in the system. So they have to treat everyone exactly the same. If you don't have a job, you can't get a loan. It's too much of a risk. It's too much of a risk to the bank or the financial entity in itself. And more importantly, it is a risk to the person undertaking the loan, as far as the bank is concerned, and certainly as far as I'm aware, as far as the law is concerned. That's why in Australia we have protections for, money day lending and various things like that. It's to try in some way safeguard those people in financial difficulty. So that seemed pretty reasonable to me. Here's a friend of mine, his post has come up on my Facebook, here's a novel idea to get money, get a job. No jobs in the area, move somewhere so you can get a job. I thought, okay, so I've responded this way, as I said, a little facetiously, but nonetheless I've responded. I'm wondering if you're volunteering to pay those expenses that people will need to move away to search for a job or to get another job outside of where they're living, because of course, no job will pay you before you start, and the banks don't offer a loan. So then he replies, you know as well as I do, Andrew, that people can get by on Centerlink. If people want more money, then get a job. Pretty simple stuff. Hey, now that response did not surprise me in the slightest. It's basically a carbon copy of his original point. He's just not talking about moving now. Yeah, okay. But I thought, I want to have a serious conversation about this. I'm thinking, here's a friend, we can have a serious and honest conversation and try to drill down to the real reality of the situation. So then I respond. And here's my response. I said to him, I think that knowledge applies to your own personal experience. I don't believe either you or I have experienced all the same hardships as some others may, including depression, entrenchment, harassment, abuse, stigma, isolation, indifference, injury, mental health issues, lack of education. I know from personal experience these hardships of supporting a partner and child with a back injury on $240 per week, which is what I was getting paid at the time through Centerlink. So much so that I lived in constant pain, technically homeless, in my car for 9 months with a bad back, because I couldn't afford the rent for where I was living when my back was injured, or the fees for the hostel that was offered for me to stay in, because of course they have costs, food, you know, a room to stay, that sort of thing. So, you know, there's a cost involved in that, and I simply did not have the money for that either. I couldn't afford my medication. When my back at the time was out, I was getting photophobia and couldn't stand up, couldn't sit down, couldn't lie down. I couldn't really do anything. And the only thing that relieved the photophobia and the constant debilitating migraines that I was getting was medication. It was 4 wafers for $30. They were little wafers. You had to stick them on your tongue or stick them under your tongue. They dissolved. They help with the migraine and with the photophobia. Now the issue was that it was 4 wafers for $30. And you could take up to 3 a day. And I needed 3 a day. That's how bad it was. Nothing else worked. Well, certainly not as effectively. Of course, you've got Panadol, you've got Nurofen, you've got codeine, all these sorts of things. The codeine was very useful that I did have because it made me very, very sleepy and ultimately did, in some regard, force my body to sleep. Even when I was in so much pain, I didn't think I could sleep. But it certainly didn't address the fact that most of the time I couldn't open my eyes because of the splitting migraines and photophobia. Which, if you don't know, photophobia is when light, or certainly in my experience, is when any light that would come into my eyes was excruciating, everything would flicker, and it was incredibly aggravating to the migraine. So, yeah, I couldn't afford my medical bills. Not only that, I couldn't afford my car payments. I had a car at the time. I didn't want to lose my car. In fact, for those 9 months, I lived in my car. I had to make that choice. I couldn't afford rent for where I was living. I couldn't afford to lose my car, I felt, because I had no other way to get around. Now remember, I could barely stand. You know, it was so aggravating. It would take me 20 minutes to navigate my way to the toilet because the pain was so bad. So how am I possibly going to do anything if I don't have a car to get anywhere? Where I lived, I didn't have immediate family. I didn't have, or certainly I felt, and I think this is still true, that I didn't have the type of friends that I would have needed to rely upon to help me to do those things. And look, you know, I was trying to be independent. So, you know, I didn't want to lose my car. For starters, it was a loan. If I couldn't pay my car, and I'd been paying off the car for a few years by this stage, I would lose the car. I'd also ruin my credit score. That would impact my ability to get another loan. Or even get another car, if I could, you know, if that opportunity could come. If I got another job at that point and was in that job for 6 months and, you know, by those means qualified to get another loan, to get a car, to afford me that possibility to go to work, they more than likely wouldn't have given me the loan anyway, because I would have defaulted on that loan. Terrible. I felt I had no choice. So what I did, excuse me, so what I did is I let my rental property go. I was no longer under a lease, and I let that go. I spent, from what I can recall, about $20, $20 a week, $20 a fortnight, to rent a storage space. Storage King. To put as much of what I could own there, including clothes, because I needed somewhere to keep my clothes so I could go. And I spent 9 months living in my car at a service station, in fact the only service station in town where I lived at the time, that provided showers for truckies. So it was the only place I could go that I had 24-hour access to a toilet and a shower. I spent so much time sleeping in my car at the local park that the police had woken me up at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning repeatedly with a flashlight, saying, "Excuse me sir, why are you here? Things seem to be suspicious, you've been here so long," all this sort of stuff. Only for me to have that conversation again and again with them. "I have nowhere to go, I'm living in my car, this is the situation," and explain it to me. And it actually got to the point when they ended up writing down my number plate and kept a record of it, so that every time they saw my car, they didn't have to ask again, because they'd asked me so many times. And it's understandable. They're trying to look after the place. You know, there's someone who seems to be loitering in a park, living there. That's understandable. You know. So, but anyway. So, you know, at other times I've been in the same situation, and my daughter, who was born overseas, was very ill. She nearly died on us in the first month that she was born. And because she was overseas, she wasn't covered by Australian Medicare or anything like that. And so there were medical bills overseas. And I was, at this particular time, I was unemployed, and I had to send money over there to make sure my daughter didn't die, and that those bills were paid. Now that's very difficult when you have a daughter overseas, which technically means she's not in your care. Therefore, I didn't qualify for any additional assistance from Centerlink. I was strictly on Newstart, single person Newstart. And yet, I managed, and it was no small feat, I can tell you, but I managed to pay the medical bills for my daughter, who was overseas at the time. But that was a separate time. At this particular time, when I was homeless in my car, it took me 9 months to save enough money to drive from where I was at the time, which was Rockhampton in Queensland, to Winton, which is a drive of about 997 kilometres, something like that. Right? It took me 9 months to save the money to drive from Rockhampton to Winton, and I came to Winton because that's where my father lived. The only person I knew who was a safe harbour, somewhere I could go and I knew that I could go, and my dad being my dad, you know, stay here, do whatever you need to do. So I went to Winton. That whole 9 months I got by eating peanut butter on bread, because there wasn't much else I could actually eat. I couldn't afford anything else for a start. In fact, the only other thing I ate was pizza on Tuesday nights, because it was actually reasonably economical for me to get their $5 pizzas, because I could get 4 meals out of it. But beyond that, I ate peanut butter on bread. Why? Because I had no refrigeration. So, I mean, I obviously can't buy anything that requires refrigeration. It would go off. So bread. You know, bread and peanut butter. Now, as I stayed in here, yeah, I got by. It took me nearly 6 months, when I finally did get a job, to start feeling physically better after eating so poorly, after eating nothing but peanut butter and bread for 9 months. When I did get the job, I still didn't have much money. It was actually at this point that I was sending money overseas for my daughter's medical bills. So when I finally did get a job, and this is not legal, by the way, but when I first did get a job, my boss at the time was very graciously aware of the fact that I had nowhere to go until I got paid, because I didn't have the money for bond or for rent or anything else. And so I slept on the floor in the back of the shop for the first 2 weeks of having the job. So that, you know, I get 2 weeks of pay under my belt. That gave me the opportunity to get bond and pay the 2 weeks advance in rent. You know, and I can tell you that it was uncomfortable for him, because legally you're not allowed to do that. That's why I won't say who it is. And second, because this particular job, I was the manager of that store. And you have to be very mindful of the fact that as manager, it's not a very good impression to have your manager sleeping out the back of the store when I am managing the other staff members. So, it doesn't look very good when you're the manager, you're the boss, and you are sleeping out the back on the floor. Now, we did that by basically getting up extraordinarily early in the morning and, just erasing any real, chance of anyone thinking that I had slept in the back of the store, that I just got there early. And of course, everyone else went home at 5 o'clock and I stayed there the rest of the night. But that's okay. So that was the first 2 weeks having the job, and then thankfully, we got enough money to, raise the bond and the advance and get a place to rent. And of course, for my boss, my immediate boss, the person who actually owned the business, and obviously, while it's not the ideal situation for his manager to be in, I think that he understood and respected the fact that yes, I obviously wasn't going anywhere, I was a reliable person, and, I was willing to do what it takes to keep the job. So, okay, so that was my response. So, we'll get back to the conversation. Their response now is, well, that's completely different. I never mentioned anything about someone who has a genuine injury or illness. My comment referred to able people who complain about Centerlink not being enough. I want to highlight that. His comment referred to able people who complained about Centerlink not being enough. People who have the ability to do a job but refuse because some work is beneath them. Now, I think that's a pretty reasonable statement. I certainly agree with the latter half of that statement, I don't have any sympathy for those people who do refuse to work because they feel that, certain work is beneath them. Although I do think it's a much more grey area than what he's stating. What sticks out to me though, he specifically states that his comment refers to able people who complain about Centerlink not being enough. In his original statement, he doesn't specify any particular group, and he doesn't exclude any particular group. So when he made that original comment, want more money, get a job. Don't have a job, move. The presumption is that that comment is intended for every single recipient of Centerlink who feels that it's a struggle to be on Centerlink and to get by. Okay? So then, his comment goes on. He says, I've seen a lot over the years and see it more and more lately. Some young people won't do manual labour, such as fruit picking, for example. Hey, I know this. I've worked in places like this, and I have seen younger people come in and ultimately choose not to do the work because it's too labour intensive and it's too difficult. Right? I will sort of diverge a little bit on the point here though, because in my experience, sure, some of those people, they did it, they chose not to keep doing that work because they felt lazy and it was easy to, whatever, go back to the dole or sell drugs or whatever it was. It doesn't matter. I'm not really interested in analysing other people's lives. But I certainly know from conversations I've had, some of those young people chose no longer to do that work, not because they were lazy, but because they became acutely aware of the fact that the type of work they were being asked to do was not reflected in the pay they were given. They were doing high labour positions, very physically intensive, with a high probability of injury or risk of injury, and yet they were paid very menial amounts. And some of them, and I think very wisely, made the decision that for their long-term future prospects, it was better to try and find something else than to continue that work and potentially injure themselves. And I think that is a very important point, because it's something that I should have learnt much, much younger than I ever did. But anyway, so that's his point. So, my response, which is very, very long, and I'm sure you can probably see it on the screen. You are correct. You never mentioned anything about someone that has a genuine injury or illness. I thought, yeah, that's fair enough. You never mentioned that. As I said, I assumed that the original statement was in reference to every single participant of Centerlink. Now, I don't think that changes the fact that for some Centerlink payments, they are far too little to expect someone to maintain the living requirements needed to qualify for a job, such as maintaining a means of transport. The vast majority of jobs that I've done that I managed to get in some form or another either required me to have a car or at least have a license, and certainly my history of having a car or having a license directly impacted upon my employer's decision to employ me in that position. I'm sure that there were many other people who were passed over for those same jobs because they didn't have a car. And they may not have even had a license. I'm sure, I know for a fact that a number of them didn't have licenses, but I'm sure that there were a number of cases where even though I and someone else may have been perfectly qualified for this job, I'm the one who got it, not necessarily because I was any better or any more qualified, but simply because I had a car. And to some employers, rightly so, that indicates that, you know, I have a capacity and responsibility to be able to maintain a car and keep a car and that sort of thing. But that's, you know, that's only part of it. So, you know, so to qualify for a job, maintain car, travel expenses. Because of course, if you don't have a car, you need travel expenses. You need to be able to travel publicly to get to that work, or to meet the requirements that job may need. You know, especially if it's something like selling, canvassing, anything like that. You need to be able to get around and fulfill the requirements of that job. You of course need presentable clothing. So you must have at least some money that you can use and utilize to buy formal wear if you need formal wear, or safety equipment if you need safety equipment, steel cap boots, PPE, all those sorts of things. Now it's gotten better. Certainly when I was younger, that was solely the responsibility of the job seeker. Now we have job seeker networks and they do have money that they can use for those sorts of things. But anyway, so presentable clothing. Of course, some people have children and they need childcare. That's a requirement of them actually having a job. You can't work if you have to look after a child, especially if they're too young to be in school. And even if they are in school, then you're still restricted by the fact that outside of those school hours, you must address the needs of the child. So of course that is a requirement. It's a living requirement to qualify for a job. You also need a stable address. I don't know of any example of an employer feeling comfortable with employing someone who does not have a fixed address unless it is seasonal work. Fruit picking, for example. But if you want to work at the local service station, restaurant, cleaner, whatever, they really need to know where you live to send correspondence to you, to have a fixed address. So of course you can't just be crashing on my mate's place every week. You know, I mean, that might help you get by in life. It might be a requirement of that situation that you're in, that you have such expenses you can't afford your own place and you are relying upon the generosity and charity of others to get by. But it does not reflect well when you're trying to get a job. Because, again, the employer has to look at that and say, well, where do I send your pay slips? Or, you know, what do I put down on the paperwork? Where's your next of kin? Where do we contact? All these sorts of things. So anyway, and I do apologise. I've actually been sick for a month. That's why I keep coughing. But anyway, so, you know, so stable address. The other thing is, of course, that a person's individual capacity to look after themselves on a day-to-day basis, monetarily or otherwise, directly affects their self-esteem. You know, especially in these situations. You're unemployed. Okay, you might be able to get by on unemployment. Especially long term, you know, it can erode your sense of self-esteem. You have a lot of people, and here's a perfect example of what we're talking about now. You have a number of people who, you know, some people are clearly under duress in the situation, being unemployed, and yet there are disparaging comments about those who rely on Centerlink payments just to get by. And this sort of comes back again to intent. Sure, there is always going to be people who will abuse the system. And you know what? Those people who want to abuse the system and take advantage of those unemployment benefits, they are not going to care one bit about your opinion. They won't. If you want to call on dole bludger, it's not going to mean a damn thing to them. You know who it is going to affect? Those genuine people who want a job, who want to contribute, who are trying to get work, can't get work despite their best efforts, and they get this constant narrative from other people who say, you're a dole bludger. You're just using the system to get by. You don't want to fucking work. Now that erodes a person's self-esteem, and it erodes a person's self-esteem to the point where, yeah, they can start to believe it, especially over a very long period. They can start to believe it to the point where they feel they are unworthy for employment. And the willingness to constantly humiliate themselves, certainly that's what it feels to some people, to humiliate themselves by applying for jobs again and again without success, can completely disenfranchise themselves from the idea of even trying to work or even trying to look for work, because it's humiliating. And on top of that, they have all these people trying to reaffirm to them, you're just a dole bludger. You're just abusing the system to get by because you don't want to fucking work, because you don't have a job. So fuck you, basically, is what some people will tell them. You know, if you get told you're not worth fucking working, or, you know, that you're worthless or that you're less than others, is it any surprise that some people, particularly younger, vulnerable people, will eventually capitulate to that idea and think that they aren't worth it and it's not worth the effort of even trying, because why bother? Every time I try, I don't get the job anyway, and I have all these people telling me that I'm a useless piece of shit. But anyway, I'm digressing a little bit. So, I'll get back to here. And I do even say here, there will always be those people who abuse the system, both for the unemployed, the working and the very rich that shelter their money from taxes. Now the whole point of that statement is just to say that you can point out anyone in any system and say, look, here is someone who is, you know, they're complaining that they're not getting enough, or, you know, or they're buying takeaway coffee with this money. They're abusing the system. It's not a reflection on everyone. Not every single person in the workforce is genuine. Some people, and you can do research on this, I'm sure, but some people, and I know this from personal experience, will disparage, manipulate, and use political motivation within the workforce to undermine anyone else in working around them. You know, I know there's people who deliberately undermine people who are trying to get jobs where they work because they fear for their own job security, which is a completely different thing, but also understandable to some extent. There are certainly rich people, the people who least need the money, who still take every opportunity they can to shelter their money and not pay their fair share in tax. And yet you want to point at a small percentage of unemployed people and say, see, here is an example of people abusing the system. They're all dole dodgers. They're all not doing what they should be doing. And anyone who complains that it's not enough is exactly that. They're the dole dodgers who are saying, I don't have enough. It's terrible. How can I possibly get by? Even though, look, here this person's buying coffee. Oh shit. They bought clothes from an expensive store out of that money that was provided to them by the taxpayers. You're talking about individuals. There will always be individuals who will abuse the system. At the moment we have issues within Australia where polygamous relationships are taking advantage of the system, and particular recipients of those benefits are getting an excessive amount compared to the average person because they're claiming for multiple spouses or multiple partners. Of course, we've also heard on any number of occasions people who have actually had more kids while unemployed. Not because necessarily they wanted kids, but because there was a financial benefit in having more kids, which meant that they would receive more money from Centerlink. And there are a number of examples where these same people have abused the kids and neglected the kids and treated them very poorly. Just because these people do it doesn't mean that applies to everyone who is on those benefits. And to suggest that is as delusional and ridiculous as suggesting that every single rich person is beyond reproach, or every single working person is completely legally abiding. It's just ridiculous. It is an unfortunate fact of the human condition that we have a faction of people, and will always have a faction of people, who will abuse and take advantage of whatever they can. So, that was the point of that. You know. Now, I agree. You know, to refuse to work available jobs such as fruit picking is not good. But I do think that it would be a detriment to Australian working conditions if people hold an overriding attitude that any job is a worthy job. I have worked jobs myself that barely paid any more than Centerlink. I've done work that took advantage of my naivete, lack of job choice and inexperience to complete work without ever being paid, or even paid fairly. In fact, when I first relocated from Winton to Rockhampton, for the first 4 or 5 years I was there, I did any number of jobs. I tried to get whatever job I could get. I've done everything from telemarketing to door-to-door knocking. There's work I've done where the only thing I received out of 3 months' work was the steel cap boots that they provided me. This constant promise of the money's coming once this job's finished and the contract's signed. You'll get your part. Never did. I've done telemarketing jobs where I've made commissions. I have records of it. And yet I was paid 30% of what I earned. Why? Well, because there's a cooling off period and, we're waiting for those cooling off periods to expire, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to say. But then 6 months down the track, cooling off period's gone, mate. That was 5 months ago. Where's that money? I've done other work where, I have done hard labour work. Come down, do a day's work. Temporary work. Yeah, there's a job here. You just need to come down. Help out with some slabbing. Do some painting. Do whatever. You do that job. They say, the money will be in the account next week. Guess what? No money. None. Why? I was trying to get whatever job I could get. I was trying to get my foot in the door. I was trying to work. I was trying to do my part. I was young. I was also naive. Right? And I didn't have many choices. I moved from out here, where I was a jack of all trades, to Rockhampton, where you needed qualifications for a lot of stuff. And I didn't have those qualifications. I had experience, because out west, in small towns like where I was from, The towns are so small, you are a jack of all trades. I started off as a yardman at the local pub, which also meant I was a bouncer, which also meant I was a barman, which also meant, you know, that I transported the beer, picked up stuff, delivered stuff, maintained things around the yard, plumbing, electricity, help fixing the roof, painting the place, all these sorts of things. But did I have a formal qualification in any of those things? No. Did I have a painter's trade under my belt? No. But I did it. That was just an expectation of the job. And that's not a criticism against that. That's just the nature of small towns. But it did mean that when I went to Rockhampton, I did not have those formal qualifications, those things on a piece of paper that people wanted to say, well, I have been painting houses for 7 years. I can paint a house with my eyes closed. I know more about paintbrushes than you do. But I don't have a formal trade. Oh, well, that's a problem, see? Because you need to have a formal trade, otherwise we can't employ you for this job. So that left me in a position where when I went to Rockhampton, the only types of job I could get were unskilled, as you would put it, and I had to take whatever jobs I could get because that was the only choice I had. Now, as I go on to say, I think that both I and this friend of mine, both are aware of unscrupulous employers out there who underpay and subjugate their employees to unfair working conditions because of a lack of job prospects, and peer pressure from those who say, suck it up, take whatever job you can. As job prospects become harder, particularly with age or circumstances that prevent employers paying your worth if they can pay next to nothing. Now, as you get older, as there's more competition, it's a job market. You know why they call it a job market? Because like any market, it works on supply and demand. If there is an oversupply of people for a given job, then that worth for an individual employee to that employer for that job goes down. Why are they going to pay someone $60 an hour to do this job when they can choose from 200 people, many of who will be in a position where they will willingly do that job for less than $60 because they need that job and they want to get into that job and they're willing to sacrifice what maybe that job is worth as far as skill, as far as cost for skill, and do that job for less than it's worth because they need that job. And there's 200 other people out there willing to take that job out from under them because they're willing to work for less. This is one of the issues we have with the 547s. I have no problem with 547 workforce, all right? But there is certainly an argument there, and I've seen it in industries I've been in, where these people from overseas who come from countries whose exchange rates are such that the money they earn here is worth much more over there, they're willing to do the jobs for less. They're willing to work harder and they're willing to work under more and more austere conditions. I've worked in industries where literally 20 to 30 of them live in a single house in order to save even more money to send overseas. I'm not going to disparage anyone on that. I'm not going to get into that because it's a whole different conversation. But I think that we can all understand that if that is the case, then you are immediately depressing the Australian wage for Australian workers, because you're asking Australians who were not under those same circumstances, who can't make those same arrangements and live collectively in a house and also pay so much less for so much more because of exchange rates, to work for the same job. $100 here in Australia will buy you what? Maybe a nice dinner out and maybe a bottle of alcohol. That $100 overseas, and I know this from personal experience, is more than a week's wage for a lot of places. It really is. I know because I've been there. I've been places where a bottle of alcohol works out to be about $8 Australian. We don't pay $8 for a large bottle of alcohol in Australia. There's a reason for that. So anyway, so yeah. So you have, you know, a job market where supply and demand. If there are so many people competing for the same job, then the conditions of that job will fall in favour of the employer. And in the employer, if they're a good employer, if they're an honest employer, will be reasonable about that. But let's not fool ourselves. There are certainly a number of employers out there who will take advantage of that. They will depress the wage that they are willing to pay for someone to do that job. And they know they can do it because, you know, they have so many people competing for that single job. Not only that, but they can demand more from the employee. Work longer hours, do overtime unpaid, take bigger risks with their physical or mental health. You know, and if you complain, you're out of a job. Someone else will have your job. You know, that's not a good position to be in, especially if you're young, inexperienced, naive, and simply do not understand what your worth is. And I think it is a consistent and ongoing issue that is progressively depressing the wage in Australia. Because the cost of living is going up, and the cost of an employee's pay is not in line with that. And I think the very clear reason for that is because the demand for jobs is so high. Because statistically, and you'll see further down when I get to those postings, statistically there are 15 plus people competing for every possible job. Right? So in other words, and we're not even talking about qualified. What that means is that as a job seeker, regardless of whether you're qualified for that job or not, you could apply for every job currently going in Australia, and there would be 15 times X number of jobs available in Australia applying for that exact same job. It's a pretty simple number. There are not enough jobs for everyone who's looking for work. There's not. The statistics from the Australian Bureau of Statistics bear that out. That's why we have an unemployment rate. That means that there is a downward pressure on the Australian wage and on the worth of paying employees, especially by certain employers, usually in unskilled areas. Because of course if you have skills, then that has a tendency to create a higher demand with less of a supply. It's the nature of it, but I think it's very foolish to ignore that. So anyway, I'll go on. I have the experience and qualifications to earn much more than I did in my last job. But they were not going to pay me what I'm worth. Only what I am worth to them. And the 20 plus other younger people, potentially naive people who can be exploited, and that's not much. It's true. Last job I had, the management job that I was talking about. You know, that job, I've done that job before. I've done that job before for 4 times what I got paid for that last job. But I also hadn't worked because of my back, and that was I'm trying to get my foot in the door, and I did that job. And thankfully, my boss, the owner of the business, he was a nice guy. He was fairly respectful towards me, and he treated me rather well. But there's no denying that if it was someone else, you know, they would have potentially tried to take on someone younger, maybe not someone who's not even got the same skill or experience that I had, because they could pay them less and expect more from them. The only reason I managed to get this job is they had tried to fill that position and had filled that position repeatedly for 3 years. And they could not find anyone to be able to do that job consistently or had the capability to do that job and run the business profitably. In fact, when I took over that job, that particular shop had not turned a profit in over a year. And the other branch, which was in another town, Charterville, had not turned a profit in 3 years. And they couldn't even keep a manager in Charterville. Most of them left within 3 months. So I got that job because everyone who had done that job lasted a few weeks to a couple of months and left because the job was too hard, they were getting paid too little, and they either, for their own benefit, they found something else and good to them, right? Or they simply couldn't handle what was required of the job. Now me, with my experience, I knew how to do that job. In fact, I turned the shop around and managed to make the shop profitable while I was there. And not only that, I covered the expenses of not just the shop here, but also the one in Charterville. Even though they still did not have a full-time manager and were unable to retain staff, I managed to keep both shops afloat. It might not sound like much, but when you walk into a situation where something hasn't been profitable for that long, you can then get it to a point where it breaks even, and that's including, during the same period, our overheads increased and what we were getting paid in remuneration was slashed 3 times. I'm very proud of that, because it means out of that one shop I managed to generate 3 times what would previously have been profitable, and I managed to keep it going and keep the shop going down in Charterville and keep those people employed, myself included, but I managed to keep those people employed for longer. Now unfortunately, it ultimately come to a point where my boss went bankrupt because he simply did not have the liquidity to get stock to keep the shop going. This was partly because the shop unfortunately caught fire here and was nearly gutted, and we actually had to shut down for a number of weeks, and that really was what broke us here, because simply things were that tight that without those 3 weeks of day-to-day business, we hit a wall and no longer had the liquidity to get stock. But that's a whole different thing. But anyway, so at the end of this point here, do we tell people to take jobs regardless of the potential for exploitation, depressing the Australian wage, or if they don't, they're just old blokes? I think it's an important point. I have no sympathy for anyone who genuinely does not want to work and has no intent for working and has no interest in working. But you're not going to stop that. But the point being that if we walk into these situations and keep reiterating this narrative that you must take any job you possibly can because you're unemployed, you're not just hurting the unemployed, you're hurting everyone. You're hurting every working person within Australia because you are devaluing what that person is worth in those jobs. Not only that, you are depressing the wage economy. You are also allowing a situation where people can become more and more exploited in those jobs because they have less and less choice. And the peer pressure placed upon them by other people tells them that if they don't suck it up, buttercup, take whatever you can, that they are somehow less than anyone else. I think it's very rich for people who have skilled employment, who then talk down to people who may be trying to get into the workforce and tell them you have to take any unskilled possible job you can when they have absolutely no experience in what that current environment is. Because I can guarantee you, personally, as someone who has worked as a business coach for businesses, I can tell you that I can take almost any white-collar worker I've ever dealt with, pull them out and make them do a blue-collar job, and they have not the slightest fucking idea how difficult that job is and more importantly, how much more difficult that white collar has made that job for that person in that blue collar position. And vice versa. I can take any blue collar worker, and have, in doing business coaching, taken them into the office and put them through their paces in trying to deal with the paperwork, the ritual, all those sorts of things that are required in a white collar job. And most of those blue collar workers have gone, holy shit, I didn't know it was this friggin' hard. And they start to get an appreciation for the fact that when they get snarky and they stop cooperating, or they buck back at certain expectations from the inner office, that they're making it harder for them because their job is already hard, and vice versa. Having white collars come in and say, we need this done by such and such tomorrow, with absolutely not a fucking idea of how hard it is to do that job, or under what conditions those people have to work. It is a complete and utter lack of experience from those people. And to have someone in high skilled work tell young people who have no experience entering the workforce that they should take whatever fucking job they can get, regardless of the consequences, and then act elitist when these people might say to themselves, but hang on, there's potential for long-term injury here. Hang on, I think I'm being exploited. I'm not getting paid very much for the amount of effort and work I'm putting into this. Why is someone profiting so exorbitantly off my hard work? Oh, but I don't have a choice, and all these people in high-skilled labour positions attack me because apparently I'm nothing but a dole bludger if I don't. That is an issue, I think. I'm not saying that it applies to everyone, or I'm not saying that everyone who is in a skilled position has that attitude. But I think that anyone who takes more than 5 minutes to think about it will be acutely aware of the fact that it is something that happens, and it is an issue that we all should be worried about. With the ongoing progress of automation, where unskilled labour is being replaced by kiosks, self-serve checkouts, all these sorts of things, the wage is being depressed further. Why is a employer going to pay someone $14, $15, $16 an hour for a junior position to do that job when they can put a kiosk up? They only need 2 or 3 people to dispense of the orders. They don't need anyone to take the fucking orders. People can do that. I'm not criticising any of the fast food chains. It's the nature of business. But I think that if you walk into something like that with a blind attitude that suck it up buttercup, then you really haven't thought it through. You really haven't thought it through. What happens when it gets to the point where those skilled jobs that some of you people like to lord over other people, what happens when they become impinged upon by automation? You know, it's not that hard. They've already got technology that allows a single person to do complex surgery without the same sort of requirements as someone who has been doing that for 20 years due to the precision of the equipment. You know, it's a bit of an extreme case, but it's nonetheless a case. It is a point. There is a point there. You are contributing to that downward pressure on the wage if you continue to reiterate this narrative that any job is a worthy job. Because if you honestly believe that, you have sold not only the Australian worker short of what they're worth, you're selling out the future of the employment industry. You really have. Anyway, next point. This friend of mine responded in kind. From personal experience, it's easy to get a job when you have a job. People have better mental health when participating in some kind of paid employment. That's why I thought work for the dole was a great idea. Guess what? A fantastic point, and I actually agree. And why wouldn't I? It is easy to get a job when you have a job. And yes, having a job improves your mental health. That is why work for the dollar is a great idea. But here's the thing. That statement there by this person, if you take that as is written, it also indicates his understanding that without a job, mental health suffers. And it's true. For a lot of people, the longer they are unemployed, the more affected their mental health becomes, the lower their self-esteem becomes, and the more difficult it is for them to get work. So my big issue with that particular comment isn't so much what he's written, I agree with it, but it's the fact that then that someone like this person would feel the need to attack someone who is in a progressively more restricted environment, where they are being affected by mental health because they haven't had a job long term, and that they are finding it more and more difficult to get a job because they don't have a job. And to then turn around and criticize these people and say that, suck it up, too bad, move, that you have no right to say it's difficult, I think shows a real lack of compassion and a real lack of understanding on something that they even stress in their point. But anyway, you make many points, some of which are completely irrelevant to this conversation. Rich people sheltering money offshore. How did that become an issue to the unemployed people? Well, I think I've already mentioned that. The simple point of the fact is, this person is making blanket statements about everyone who is on Centerlink who feels that it is too restrictive, either fiscally or the requirements for it. My point is that just because someone feels that a particular system is restrictive doesn't mean that they are someone who is abusing the system. But to then have conversations around this and make suggestions that these people are abusing the system because they're complaining and that they have no rights to complain and they should shut the fuck up, really shows the disconnect there between reality and the situation. It doesn't matter what system it is. You will always find people who will circumnavigate the rules, who will abuse the system, who will take advantage of it, who will have a workaround. Drugs are not allowed in prisons. Neither are weapons. Yet we all know that drugs get in prisons, and clearly weapons manage to get in prisons because people get killed in prisons. Now, prisons, you have guards. You have people constantly monitoring you. You have people who look up your ass looking for contraband. You have people who toss cells, look under the sheets, everything else, and yet they still manage to get contraband into prisons. Now think about that for a minute. This is a highly regimented system which is deliberately designed with a high level of resources to prevent contraband getting into these environments, and yet people can get around it. You know what? It's the same as anything else. You can do whatever you like to the unemployment system. You can make it as restrictive as you like, you can make it as austere as you like, you can do whatever you want, but ultimately you will never eradicate the fact that there will be someone out there who will take advantage of that system and abuse it. It is impossible. It is as impossible as trying to eradicate all IT viruses. It's just not possible. Every time you make up one solution to prevent a particular virus from getting on your computer, someone thinks of a way to get around that, or tweak it, or change it. And it's the same as the system. Same as the working system, the taxation system, the voting system, the unemployment system. We can do the best we can, I'm not saying we shouldn't. But to lump everybody into this group and say, well, everyone who complains about the system and how it's difficult is, should be tarred with this brush, that they're abusing the system, that they're snowflakes, that they're not trying, I think is probably the most astounding lack of logic I can possibly think of. And the fact that I tried to point this out with, abuse happens everywhere, with rich people, with working people. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing. Maybe I'm wrong. feel free to leave a comment. Let me know. I really want to know. But I think it was a fairly reasonable point that, you know, this person's clearly talking in blanket terms about unemployed people, you know, Centerlink benefit recipients. I'm just trying to point out that, you know, there's a disparity there. You're talking about a group of people as if they're all the same. Not everyone in that group behaves the same. Not everyone in that group abuses the system. Not everyone in that group, right, deserves that sort of ridicule or vitriol just because they feel that it is difficult to be in that system. Anyway, I'll go on. So he says, I'm of the belief that any kind of paid work is good work. Someone willing to make sacrifices by moving and taking a low-paid job is on the road to a higher-paid job eventually. Employers will and do respect experience and pay accordingly for people with the right work ethic. Now, this is certainly a valid point. And yes, there are a lot of employers out there who do. They value experience and they pay accordingly, and, you know, they value high work ethic. Right. And yes, certainly traditionally that has been something that has worked within the working industry. But yes, you get a low-paying job, you do your hours, you do your time, and you slowly get promoted up the ladder. But this is from 20 years ago. This is from when you could join the railway and you had a job for life. I know this because one of the first real jobs I got, long-term jobs I got in Rockhampton, was with Queensland Rail. Queensland Rail, who's traditionally been known at the time that if you have a job with Queensland Rail, you have a job for life, boy. Whee! You know, seriously, I was quite happy to stay in that job until retirement. That job lasted 15 months. I was on an apprenticeship, or sorry, a traineeship. I was on a traineeship. I was never assessed in 12 months. The assessors never came in that 12 months when I was supposed to be assessed and get the qualifications for that job. They came 1 month before my traineeship was about to expire and said, so where are you up to on your assessments? I said, I haven't seen anyone since I started. Oh, really? So then they went and spoke to the boss and extended my traineeship by 3 more months to assess me, to give them the opportunity to come and assess me. I wonder if you can guess what happened. If you said that 3 months later I was out of a job and they had never returned to do that assessment for me to formally qualify for that traineeship, you would be correct. You would be 100% correct. And not only this is with Queensland Rail. An institution that typically, if you were willing to, you had a job for life. In that same 12 months I was there, they were laying staff off. Volunteer redundancy, they call it. Because they were trying to cut down the workforce and they were contracting their workforce. Now, to the best of my knowledge, Queensland Rail actually doesn't exist. I think it's now owned by Azuron. But nonetheless, this was an industry that 20 years ago people were telling me, if you get into Queensland Rail, you have a job for life. 20 years ago, you would get told, if you got a job in the meatworks, you have a job for life. That is also an industry that no longer holds true with that. I know that from personal experience. So yeah, sure, you know, we used to have an opportunity to start at the bottom, put your hours in, do your time, learn your skills, get cross-promoted, get up-promoted, you know, evolve into higher positions. It was 20 years ago. Anyone who's taken any time and any effort to look at the situation as it currently stands will clearly recognise that those opportunities have become increasingly rare, because most industries now do not have that sort of longevity, and certainly most businesses do not have the ability to retain staff or positions for that long in such a competitive workforce or in such a competitive marketplace. It may still be possible. I'm sure if you train to be a policeman, yeah, you potentially have the possibility of being in that job for life, or even a doctor or anything like that. That may still exist. But it certainly doesn't exist for anyone who traditionally would have been unskilled. Because, you could join Queensland Rail with no skills. You learnt on the job. You learnt how to load wagons, how to do manifests, how to do loading, all these sorts of things. But if you didn't have an education, that was something you could do. And that was something that could put you on the path for a long-term career, long-term employment, safety, security. It doesn't exist anymore. I mean, not the least of which because a vast majority of it's now been automated. So there is less and less demand for people to handle the logistics. Computers do it. So yeah, sure, you can... Policeman's probably one of the few things you could do reasonably easily with regards to education, I would suggest. I mean, it's not like you've got to go through, 5 years of college to become a policeman. So, that's a possibility. But I think it's pretty easy to see that for the vast majority of jobs out there with any real longevity, yeah, they're postgraduate. They require college work. And that's fine if you have the resources to get into college and to maintain a academic career in college and to complete that and then be able to pay back those loans or to participate in the workforce. That is, if those works are still there. Keep in mind, of course, that if everyone was to undertake that, if everyone, or even the vast majority of unskilled people tomorrow made the decision to go in to college to work for higher skilled positions, there's really only 3 things that come from it. Number 1, you will have a shortage of unskilled people doing menial jobs, which will then tip the balance in their favour. 2, the only people who's really going to profit out of that system is the colleges. That's the nature of business. The reason being is because 3, if all of those people do put their head down, bum up, work hard, learn all their skills, and become qualified, you will then have a mass exodus of now newly skilled people into the workforce for these jobs with a high skill demand and a limited number of jobs. So now you've depressed the high end of the workforce, if you like, those higher paying jobs. Their wages will come down because, of course, why are you going to pay Dr. X $200,000 a year to do this when you have thousands of choices standing in line behind them who are willing to do it for less and less and less and less and less and less? And all these people who now have debt that they need to pay off, who ideally went into that situation thinking that they could get a high paying position to pay back that job, to pay back that loan, I should say, because that's the expectation. You do college, you get a job, you get the high income job that allows you to pay back that loan. Well, now they're competing for less and less jobs. Most of them will be unsuccessful in getting those jobs. So then you have a high portion potentially you have a high portion of the population who is highly skilled yet unemployable in realistic terms, because there won't be enough jobs for them. And not only that, they will have a high level of debt, which will depress their quality of living or become a burden on the taxpayer, who of course subsidises, in certain circumstances, subsidise those loans until those people can pay it back. But anyway, we'll move on. He goes on, equally, if an employer is taking advantage of employees, naivety, then that person is free to find another job somewhere else. That's a statement that really befuddles me. It is correct, but it befuddles me. because on one hand you're saying that, you know, people have the opportunity to move on and find another job. You're not addressing the reason why they would feel the need to move on and find another job. And at the same time you're telling them to take whatever the fuck they can get. That really baffles me. That single sentence is really baffling to me. And maybe, you know, maybe one of you can explain it to me. Put it down in the comments. I really want to understand that, because to me it makes absolutely no sense, in as much as clearly this person has an expectation that everyone should shut the fuck up and take whatever job they can get. And yet, they aren't going to address the reasons why someone may feel compelled to leave a job. And then say they have the freedom to do so anyway. He goes on to say, it's interesting we have fussy unemployed people complaining that there aren't suitable jobs for them, when I know 2 local companies that employ 457 visa workers. Sorry, I probably said that wrong before, but 457 visa workers. Because no one wants to relocate to do a rural work in meatworks. Now here is one of the biggest misnomers that I know of. In my personal experience, I worked in a number of industries that relied heavily upon 457 workers. Engineering, meatworks being 2 of the biggest. At the meatworks that I worked at, more than 90% of the staff were 457 workers. At the engineering place that I worked at, I would say that was probably closer to 70–80%. And I can tell you that the reason why 457 visa workers are employed so readily by some companies is because they are willing to do it for a depressed wage, with higher demands, longer hours, faster work, and they can't complain because, in my experience, especially in the meatworks, almost all of them couldn't speak English. If any of them had a genuine complaint, who the fuck are they going to talk to? Because I can tell you there was a handful of people at the meatworks who would act as translators because they didn't fucking speak English to anyone else. Now that's their choice, but I think, as I said before, there's also this misnomer that you know, they're competing on a level playing field with Australian workers, and they're not. These people are here on a working visa. They are congregating, for the most part, they are congregating in communal housing, and they are sending as much of the money as they possibly can earn back overseas, where the value of the Australian dollar is considerable. I can tell you that when I was at the meatworks, $100 Australian was equivalent to a month's pay for my partner. $100 was a month's pay for my partner's family. Now, when you have workers who are willing to do whatever it takes to make money that in their own personal local economy is worth that much, is it any surprise? Shit, I would do just about anything if you said to me that for every $100 it would be worth a month's wages. $500 a week would be the equivalent of 5 months' earnings. That would be incredible. I'd have a house in no time. I could buy almost any car I wanted. So it's certainly not a surprise that these people do it, and I don't begrudge them from doing it. They're trying to make best of the situation they're in. But to suggest that they are competing on the same level playing field as an Australian worker is about as misguided as you can get. They do not pay the same rent equivalency as an Australian because they live in communal housing. That's certainly something that Australians can do, but they do. They live in communal housing, and typically they they have communal foods. They share food and they cook large batches and all this sort of stuff. I know this because I've worked with them. I've spoken to some of them who actually could speak some English. Wasn't very many, but I can tell you. Then they're very nice people and have nothing against them. But this thing, fussy, unemployed people complaining they're unsuitable jobs because there's 547 workers wanting to relocate to a rural area. You know what? It doesn't affect them. They come to Australia on a tourist visa, they do as much work as they can and they go home. And in that time, they have earned the equivalency of a few years worth of earnings in 6 months to 12 months. In the time that they've earned, because of the exchange rate, that's what they've earned. And yeah, they're going to live out in rural areas because they're in large communal groups. They're familiar, they have lots of people around them they know. That's part of their culture as well. It's being used to large groups. Right? Being used to having large families, used to having lots of people in the same house. I don't know too many people within Australia who would be comfortable, and this would include Mr. Amos. I don't think he would be very comfortable with the prospect of another 6 or 8 families suddenly moving into his place to decrease the rental pressure on each person there. Certainly not people who aren't related. I'm bloody sure that he would feel extraordinarily uncomfortable by the prospect of having 6 to 8 unrelated families move into his place to reduce the rental pressure on him and everyone else. That's not a criticism against him. It's just the nature of our culture. Our cultures are different. They culturally are accepting of that over there. We're not inclined to do that. We're much more inclined to want our own individual space. There's nothing right or wrong with that. It's just the reality of the situation. So, you know, I don't see that this argument with regards to 457s being at all legitimate or even making any real pragmatic sense. If you scrutinise that conversation, if you scrutinise the differences between the 457 workers and the Australian worker, you will see there is a very large disparity there between what they both have to deal with. Australian workers do not have the luxury of renting a place out for 6 to 12 months, earning money for 6 to 12 months, and then, you know, effectively going away with the equivalent of a few years worth of money. It just doesn't work like that. I'm very sorry to sorry, my phone is going off. Oh. Sorry about that. But I mean, I'm actually dumbfounded that Mr. Amos doesn't even understand or realise this. If he's worked with these people, if he's worked with 457 visa workers, he would know this. It was the same as at the engineering place that I worked. These people are extraordinarily hard workers. Extraordinarily hard workers. And are inclined to take high risks. One of the biggest issues we had at the engineering place that I worked at was that we would have daily meetings every morning to talk about take fives, which is a safety mechanism, right? Designed to keep everyone safe. And the vast majority of people there did not speak English or understand what was being said at the meeting. And we would have the same meeting every day. And these meetings were, we had paperwork, you'd have to go out, do a take 5. It means basically take 5 minutes, assess risks, assess damages, you know, assess potentials, all these sorts of things. It's perfectly reasonable. It's certainly something you should do in a high risk environment. But it was a bit of a farce because the Australians who were there, a lot of them really did not take it as seriously as they should, and the reason for that is because there was a clear understanding that the vast majority of people there did not understand what was being said and you know, it makes a farce of it. And then I would go around, because I was actually manager there, I was a warehouse manager there, and I would see these people working in high risk environments, welding, cutting, all these sorts of things. And as far as Australian safety and the things we would have conversations about in those mornings, I never saw any real example of them being implemented. These people would take high risks, they would work very fast. There was almost never, I have never seen a 457 worker stop working for 5 minutes to do a take 5, ever, in the entire time I was there. Now, I'm not saying that they aren't conscientious people. They would work in pairs, so that if someone was injured, someone was always watching, so they could, you know, pull them out if the machine was about to crush their arm or anything like this. So I'm certainly not criticising them, and again, it's the nature of the business, it's the nature of the work and the work that's involved. But, you know, this is just what happens in these situations. They are inclined to take bigger risks. They are inclined not to cut corners, but not to take safety measures that might require time, such as taking a step back from what they are doing, engaging in take 5 principles, which means to stop what you are doing and to step out of your work space or away from your work site. Look broadly at any potential hazards. Make an assessment of what hazards they are, what potential hazards they are. Address them, write them down, then go through a process of addressing each one of those hazards or bring them to the attention of the supervisor or the manager, and then put in place mechanisms to address all those hazards. They wouldn't. Because they're working for their lives. They're working for everything they possibly can. They will just go, and then just dive in and do it. Now that's fine, but at the same time you're asking Australian employees to work in a safe environment, to undertake those safety checks, and to work competitively with these people. It's not possible. It's not possible when there is effectively 2 standards by which employees are being held accountable to. You can't say that Australians are lazier because they are invoking what they're being told to do, which is to step back, take 5, assess dangers, make running assessments of potential hazards, and yet this other person is already in the job doing it. You can't say that that's being lazy. To do so is to devalue the whole point of workplace health and safety. It's also to ignore the disparity between what is real and what the expectations are on both 457 visa workers who, in my experience, do not speak English, the vast majority of them, and never have a direct one-to-one conversation with a supervisor or a manager. It's always done through a third party, whether it's another 457 worker who translates or whatever. But there is a gap there. If there was suddenly a fire, not that I'd want that on anyone, but if there was suddenly a fire somewhere in a place like that, you'd be very hopeful that those people were very self-aware of the dangers, because I can guarantee you that if a supervisor was to get over the intercom and say, such and such a hazard exists, please exit the building, there would be a very large portion of that workforce who would not understand what is being said. And again, I'm not criticising anyone. The whole point of this conversation is not to criticise employers. They're trying to do what they can to make their businesses both as profitable as possible and as sustainable as possible. So of course, they're going to take advantage of that. I'm not criticising the 457 visa workers. They're doing what they can to support their family at home. And who wouldn't take advantage of the opportunity to earn a considerable amount of money in a short time frame? I certainly would. If I knew that I could go to another country, work for a year, and come back with what was the equivalent of 5-6 years worth of money, I'd do it in a heartbeat. Shit, you mean I get to travel overseas, visit a country I've never been to before, and come back and not feeling anxiety of being under financial duress? I think anyone who says they wouldn't clearly has never travelled or really thought about it. So yeah. Anyway, so Mr. Amos goes on and says, if you recall our time at Winton, when we were both on the dole and there was no work around, I moved to Longreach, got more casual work. After I could afford it, I moved to Emerald. I haven't been out of work since. I have moved and worked all over Australia before finally buying a farm and basing myself here in Victoria. You know what? I commend him. I really do. There is only two real issues I have with this. Number one is, he's right. When we're in Winton, we were both on the dole, nearly of work age, and on the dole. Actually, that's not exactly correct, because I was actually working at the Winton Hotel. Whether he was on the dole, I don't know. I think he was. But I was working at the Winton Hotel. In fact, I'd been working, at the time, I never even finished grade 11. I was working. But yeah, okay. So, I mean, there was certainly a period when I was in Winton and I was on the dole. But I don't believe it was at that time. I'm pretty sure he left before I was on the dole. Anyway, so yeah, okay. So, you know, we were both on the dole. That's fine. Right? The real issue I have here, right, is we're talking about 20 plus years ago. You've got to keep in mind, Bill and I were both in our early to mid 40s. 20 years ago, we had no partners, we had no dependents, we were solely responsible for our own welfare, no one else. So we had the freedom to move around if we had the means to move around. And we could certainly chase work wherever the work was. And we also had a smaller population competing for that work. Because in case you've missed the boat, our population is increasing and has been year on year for the last 20 years. While the number of jobs has not increased in line with that population growth. So, yeah, okay. So he got work 20 odd years ago. He managed to move around. That's good. I'm actually proud of the guy. You know, that's commendable. But there's a disconnect there, because he's talking about an historical event that happened 20 years ago. The environment under which both him and I got work 20 years ago is not the same as the environment that younger people experience when entering the workforce now. It's just not. And anyone who tells you it is has been in the workforce far too long and far too disconnected from the situation. And this is the biggest issue I have with this. Because he goes on to say that he hasn't been out of work since. So by his own admission, Mr. Amos, since 20 plus years ago, has never been out of a job. And yet he feels that he has the experience and the authority to talk about the circumstances that face unemployed people on a day-to-day basis today. We didn't have computers before 1995, prevalent in society. You know, we don't act elitist and suggest that, you know, those people who grew up without a computer are somehow less than we are because they don't really understand how to utilise that technology to their best their advantage. It's because they don't have the same experience. I don't understand, well, I won't say I don't understand, but I certainly don't use Twitter or some of these, you know, Snapchat or any of these sort of things. Why? Because I'm not familiar with them. I'm a Facebook person. You know, that's what I grew up with. That's what I'm familiar with. You know, but I would be extraordinarily arrogant if I suggested I even knew a single thing about what people should or should not do on Twitter. I don't fucking use it. What possible reason would I have to think that I am the most qualified and most experienced person to comment on it? I don't use it. And that's the same with this comment here by Mr. Amos. He's never been out of work for 20 plus years. It's very commendable, but it also demonstrates the sheer arrogance that he has. He has the audacity to comment on other people's circumstances of which he has no familiarity and no experience for the last 20 years. You'll see this comes up later when we talk about circumstances facing rural areas. He has not a clue. And I don't begrudge him that. Look, we all are ignorant of things that we don't have experience with, or certainly not recent experience with. So yeah, I don't have any vitriol for him. I don't hate him for it, but I do find that it is a clear sign of a sort of endemic arrogance that has crept in because he is so disconnected from the circumstance that surrounds those people who experience these situations today. He goes on to say, I put that down to being flexible enough and willing to work jobs from milling oats to driving 400 plus ton excavators in a mine and lots of jobs in between. My point is that if a person is going to sit around complaining that the benefit they receive from hard working taxpayers isn't enough, then they should suck it up and change the situation. Get a higher education, take on new skills via short courses, relocate to an area that has better employment prospects. On the surface, they all seem reasonable, things to say. Get a higher education, get new skills via short courses, relocate. But again, there's this disconnect. If someone is telling you that I am just getting by on what I am receiving by Centerlink, it's just enough to get food every week, to pay rent, to do all these sorts of things, and you suddenly impose upon them this expectation that they should get a higher education, how are they going to pay for it? And you can say, well, the government helps subsidise education. Yes, that comes from the taxpayers as well. So then where's the anger in that? There's anger here that people on Centerlink saying they're not earning enough. They're not getting enough to be able to live comfortably. And someone like Mr. Amos starts complaining, well, it's taxpayers' money. And then at the same time say, get a higher education. That shows two things. Number one, the idea that someone who has a set amount of money can somehow magically create a large sum of money to go to education by their own means is completely disconnected from reality. It would be like me walking down the street finding a new school leaver who's just recently left high school and say, quick, I want you to raise $20,000 so you can buy a fucking car, dude. You need loans for that, which, as we said before, if you don't have a job, you can't get a loan. But if they were to get a loan through the government, which is possible, this is still taxpayers' money. So I really want to understand And I mean this. Please, if you can explain this to me, write it down in the comments. But I want to understand, why is there such vitriol for those who are using taxpayers' money to support themselves on Centerlink while trying to find work, and yet it's perfectly acceptable, and there's no vitriol around the idea of using that same taxpayers' money to get a higher education for a potential job? I really want to understand that. It's the same as take on new skills via short courses. Sure, again, where's the money coming from? Is it coming from the taxpayers? Because if it's not coming from Centerlink, which is taxpayers' money, then it's got to come from government assistance, which is taxpayers' money. If it's not coming from either of those, then it means that this person who is barely getting by has to somehow find the money, or someone like Mr. Amos must be suggesting that someone is putting their hand up saying, well, I volunteer, I'll give you money for it, because I want you to work. But as you'll see, that's not how he feels. He's not willing to put his hand up and give handouts. And I agree. I actually agree. Don't give handouts to people if there are better ways to do it. And I certainly don't expect Mr. Amos to give handouts to people to get education. But I really want to press upon the point that there seems to be such a disconnect here between the expectations that he is placing upon other people and the reality of the situation. But we'll move on. Let me just have a... Okay. So here's my response. As I said previously, are you volunteering to pay the expenses needed for those who have no money to move, such as transport, rent, bond, food, school fees? Again, I'm being facetious. I'm trying to make a point. I'm trying to get Mr. Amos to think instead of just parrot or reiterate what he's got stuck in his head. There's some sort of entrenched idea he's got stuck in his head that he's not thinking about, or at least that's my impression. I may be completely wrong, and if I am, you know, I'm willing to have that conversation in the comments. But to me, it seems like he has become fixated on this expectation without any real tether to the real world. I go on to say, if not, then I think comparing your circumstance to others is a little misguided. And this gets back to the conversation we just had. I say, I don't recall when we were in Winton that you had a partner or dependents. Having young vulnerable children or older infirmed family restricts someone's flexibility. Or are you suggesting grandparents, children and other dependents should be forgotten about in the pursuit of a job? Seems pretty reasonable to me. If you have a toddler who's too young to go to school, or even if they are going to school, you have to be mindful of the welfare of that child. You can't just suddenly go relocate to a different town, chase work from here to there. You can't. I mean, yeah, fruit picking is a great idea, but if you're a single parent, what do you do with your child while you're fruit picking for seasonal work? Do you drag your child along, or do you leave them with a stranger? I mean, it's a legitimate question. I mean, obviously, if you have a partner and they're capable of looking after after your child, then that certainly can help. But then you also have the added pressure of needing to support them as well. Not just your child, but your partner, because they must be able to look after the child while you're at work, which means they aren't capable of working either. So I'm really trying to understand this. If you have a single parent, mother or father, doesn't matter, but a single parent, you're telling them that if they don't chase seasonal work, they don't meet your expectations. And yet, you're not putting your hand up to help support that person in order to, you know, look after their child, whether it's school fees, daycare, childcare, anything like that, then have you really thought this through? I mean, sure, you can put them in daycare, but if you're moving around in seasonal work, what, they're going to be in daycare 3 months in one place, 3 months in another? I mean, really, have you put any thought into this at all? Have you actually sat down and thought about what you're asking other people to do? Or are you just comparing it to your circumstance? I'll go on. You and I were also young, not subjected to the same discriminations as others experience, I should say. Particularly the older people, they do, let's be honest, there is ageism in the workforce. Undereducated, infirmed, or socially disadvantaged. As I said to him, I commend him for making headway in his life in the way that he has, but I'm curious, has he suffered any debilitating injuries that have restricted his job prospects? I ask that because I have. My back injury, as I talked about before. When I was younger, I used to do fencing out here, out west. It's a very labour-intensive job, or it certainly was 20 years ago. You would be lugging around, the posts for the fences over your arms. These are heavy objects. You'd be running wire. You'd be doing these sorts of things. Lots of bending. I used to do cementing. Same thing. Shoveling cement, laying out pads, doing all those sorts of things. This is a high-stress physical activity that places a significant amount of stress and labour upon your back. Now I can tell you that I still have issues with my back, even though I'm obviously better than I was when it happened, and I can go significant periods of time without too much aggravation and can stand and work and do lots of things, but I think it would be extraordinarily risky and even foolish for me to just go and start fencing tomorrow because it's the only job I can get. Because I have to keep in mind that if I further damage my back, or I aggravate my back in such a way that I'm physically incapable of completing the work or undertaking the work that's being required of me, I'm out of a job. And not only that, I wouldn't be able to stand again or do any of those things that I experienced previously. Which means that my daughter, who is now in grade 2, would effectively have to fend for herself. Because I certainly would be restricted in how I can look after her if I can't physically get up, if I'm suffering from photophobia and migraines and everything else. Now, to people who aren't privy to that situation, most people will take a look at me and go, he looks pretty healthy. I mean, I look a little overweight because, of course, I'm rather sedentary these days because of my back. But, people will take a look at me and go, there's nothing preventing him from doing physically laborious work. And that's a fair statement. I don't look like I'm the sort of person that laborious work would be an issue for. In fact, I would suggest I probably look like the sort of person who needs as much laborious work as possible. Because, as I said, I'm a bit sedentary. I'm a bit soft in the middle. So yeah, hard work would be a bloody good thing if it helped me lose weight. But the point being is that just because I look that way does not mean that I feel confident enough to risk my daughter's welfare on. And I know this because the last job where I was the manager of the shop, I still had back issues. I had weeks where I had migraines and everything else. And you know what the difference was? As a manager, I could chew painkillers and sit in the back office and still be somewhat productive because I could delegate that work to my employees. I could still manage to do that work because even though I couldn't stand, I could sit. Even though it hurt a lot, I could chew painkillers. I could do those sorts of things to manage that in that job position. And I did. I didn't take any time off in that job because my back suddenly shifted and now I have photophobia and can't stand and, aching kidneys and my legs are tingly and whatever. I didn't take that time off. I wanted to keep working. So I managed that situation. But here's the thing. I can't manage that situation in the same way if I'm in a high labour position. If I'm cementing, laying a pad, running fences, doing any of these sorts of things. Not only can I not do it, I would be a risk to others. If I'm driving a car on a job like that, around other people, and I'm moving fences and all of a sudden I jump in the car, which has happened to me, and my back suddenly shifts and all of a sudden, you know, I'm in excruciating pain and migraines and photophobia and everything else, what happens to those people who might not have a license I'm responsible for transporting? Or if the car's currently in motion and I suddenly lock up and my leg, you know, gets down on the accelerator. That hasn't happened, but I've certainly had points where holy moly, I tell you what, it takes a bit, just pull your foot off the thing and park the car and say, that's it, I can't do anything. You can't do that on a job with a high labour requirement. And just because I don't look like I'm, you know, physically disabled in a way that's going to prevent me from doing those jobs, because I'm not hobbling around like someone who looks like they've been through a mangler, doesn't mean that I'm not conscientious of the fact that it is a concern of mine. And more importantly, it is irresponsible of me not to take that into consideration when looking for work, particularly because of my daughter. Because I'm no longer responsible just for my welfare. If it was just my welfare, it wouldn't be an issue. Okay, so I do a job and my back goes out and I'm stuffed. The only person that's going to hurt is me. I'll be out of a job again and I can't work and physically will find it difficult to move around, and I'll have to deal with it. And I've been there. I know how to deal with that. I don't want to deal with it, but I have had to do it before and I know how to deal with it. Same as I know I know what it feels like to spend 9 months living in a car eating peanut butter and bread. I know what that feels like, and I know that I can do it if I absolutely have to, if I'm put in no other situation. But can I expect that of my daughter? No. Should I expect that of my daughter? No. Would I be an extraordinarily irresponsible parent for even considering on risking that possibility for my daughter? Of course. So I'm not going to, I'm sorry, Bill, you know, I know this doesn't meet your expectations. But no, I'm not going to apply for fencing work, even though I have the experience, I have the qualifications, and I've done it before. I'm not going to apply for fencing work because the risk is too high. It may not be something that you have to worry about, but it is something that I have to worry about. Now that doesn't mean I don't want to work. And as I said before, the last job, I did it even when I was in excruciating pain. I could chew painkillers, I could manage that situation. That was a situation where I could manage the day-to-day requirements of that job, even if I was in extreme pain. And I also had less concern that I could re-injure my back and make it worse, because it was a low impact position. I'm sitting in a chair, I'm managing a shop, I'm walking around, I'm delegating, I'm doing those sorts of things. The same can't be said for a high labour position. If I go and do a high labour position, I risk re-injuring my back further, or aggravating the residual injury that I have even worse, to the point where I may have to have my spine fused. Whatever. You know. But from what you're saying, you know, well, it's not about, you know, people are ill or injured. Here's a newsflash for you, Bill. I have a back injury. According to Centerlink, it doesn't restrict my capability of working, because of course it doesn't. I can work. But it does restrict the job opportunities that I have available to me that I believe is responsible, that would be responsible for me to undertake. It would be completely irresponsible for me to not only, you know, potentially disadvantage an employer by taking on a job that I may not physically be able to do in the long term, because they're going to invest time in employing me and setting me up and doing all this paperwork, and, you know, 6 months down the track I may not be able to do that job anymore, and they'll be like, well, shit, I could have employed someone else who could have done this job and not had the same issues. So of course, you know, what do? Lie to employers and say, no, nothing's wrong. I'm fine. No, I'm built like a tank. You know, I'm like a 20-year-old. I have to be mindful. I have to respect the fact that employers should have some discretion in taking on someone who may potentially impact upon their bottom line in their business. And that means that if an employer has a job that I don't feel confident that I can do without potential repercussions, I need to let them know. At the very least, because they're gonna fucking want to know. Because if I do have further injury at work, they don't want to be responsible for that. They don't want to be suddenly blindsided by the fact that I lied to them and took on this job without disclosing previous injuries. And this is one of the reasons why later on, when I brought up the meatworks, I specifically asked you to ask your boss if he's willing to take someone who has a previous back injury. Because in my experience, no one in the meatworks will take anyone on with a previous back injury. Why? Because of fucking litigation. Because of concerns about potential for re-injury and being open to litigation. It's, you know, it's not a hard thing to expect. I mean, I respect it. It frustrates me as someone who wants to work, but I respect the fact that employers should have that discretion, because it is a risk that the employer has to take on then. Am I potentially taking on someone who can't fulfill the requirements of the job in the long term? Am I potentially employing someone who may re-injure themselves and open me up for potential litigation? I don't think you've even thought about that, Bill. I really don't. And if you have, as you've suggested, suffered from injuries, I wonder how honest you are with your employers, I should say, and how they would react if they found out. But nonetheless, let's move on. I go on to say, you know, have you always had access to reliable transport to maintain a job, or the ability to search one? Search for one. Have you suffered anxiety and depression that has affected your ability to socialise? Have you lost your home or car due to weather, loss, job, or inability to maintain loans? Were you a sole parent to a child when you moved around pursuing work? I think anyone who takes any minute to think about that will see that all of those impinge upon a person's ability to be flexible, to be able to move around, you know, without discretion to wherever the work is. Now here's where things get interesting, because I'm pretty sure at this point this is where Bill's started to take things personally. And it wasn't something I was intending, and it also sort of indicates to me that he's not really reading what I'm writing down, what I'm presenting to him. Or maybe I'm just not wording it correctly. Hey look, you know, I've been known to do that before, so, you know, if you think I'm not wording things very accurately, let me know. But he goes on and says, you keep asking for a handout with relocation costs. Well, as I said, I'm being facetious. I'm not asking for a handout. I'm just trying to get Bill to exercise some discretion in his thinking and to think about it. If it's not coming from Centerlink and it's not coming from a bank loan or pre-work wages, it's got to come from somewhere. So, you know, since he's complaining about it, he must be putting his hand up, surely. I mean, again, I'm being facetious, but to me it just seems amusing. He goes on, I'm pretty sure the government grant, that there is a government grant to relocate should someone find work in another area, but don't quote me. No one gave me a handout to get anywhere. I did it all on my own, so it can be done. Pretty sure when we lived in Winton you didn't have a partner or dependents either, but you managed to get around, didn't you? Now, I'm going to take that bit and let's break it down. He's right. The government does provide grants to relocate on the condition that you have secured work in another area. I know this because I've asked. I've looked into it because I have looked at moving to other locations to find work, particularly before my daughter was with me. I had to consider her needs. and I had the flexibility to go wherever I want and still be able to live in my car. Here's the thing though, and this is understandable. The government is not just going to give you money to go look for work in another area. Why would they? I mean, you and I'm pretty sure would realise that that would quickly get abused. I mean, if I was inclined to do so, and the government was giving money for me to go look for work, I'd go and look for work on the Gold Coast. I wouldn't mind spending a week on the Gold Coast, going to the beach and looking for work. I'd even legitimately go and look for work, even if I didn't want to work. Because hey, a trip to the Gold Coast. Shit, that sounds fucking amazing. But of course, they don't do that. They give you a grant to relocate with a guarantee of work. What that means is, the person who is going to employ you in that area outside of where you currently reside, they have to provide a guarantee of work. This is a guarantee that if you were to relocate to that area, you have that job, that you will start, and it is full-time or significant part-time work. That may have changed, but that was certainly my understanding when I looked at it. Because obviously they're not going to pay thousands of dollars for me to relocate to Western Australia to do temporary work, are they? They're certainly not going to pay, you know, a few $100s every few months for someone to relocate town to town to do seasonal work for picking pineapples and bananas and the like. You really think that the Australian government would do that? And it's not a criticism on the government. Of course, I would not expect them to do that because, again, people are going to abuse the system. Because, you know, if that was the case, then, yeah, why wouldn't you go do seasonal, you know, get a grant from the government, travel to Emerald, go pick cotton, 3 months later, unemployed, because the cotton season's over. Hang on, hand up, can you give me another grant so I can relocate to, I don't know, Nambour? I wouldn't mind picking some pineapple. You know, that's not going to happen. So the point here is, again, it's frustrating, but it's understandable. The government will give you a grant to relocate, but it is on the condition of guaranteed work, either full-time or significant part-time. And that's understandable. They want you to work, they want people in the workforce just as much as some people want to be in the workforce. But they're not just going to hand it out. So, okay, yeah, so if you're on Centerlink and you're only just earning enough money to get by, and you do manage to locate a job outside of your area, outside of your town or your city, and it's work you can go and do, you can start, and that employer is willing to write a guarantee of employment and submit that guarantee of employment to Centerlink to demonstrate that yes, you have a guaranteed job if you relocate, then the government, yeah, they will pay for it. They will give you the assistance needed to relocate. So yeah, of course, you know. Now here's the other thing, and this is where I really start to think that Bill is not really thinking straight about what he's saying. He says, pretty sure when we lived in Winton, you didn't have a partner or dependents either, but you managed to get around, didn't you? Yes, well that was my point, Bill. My point was that when you and I had the luxury of moving and chasing work town to town, neither you nor I had a child to consider who may either be too young to go to school, in which case they need full-time care, or potentially would have to relocate school every single time you chase work, which is extraordinarily stressful on a child to relocate every 6 months or 12 months. I know this because I've experienced it in my own childhood, being relocated every 12 fucking months because my mother wouldn't stay in the same place for longer than a fucking year. Excuse my language. But, you know, I've experienced that. I know how much upheaval that is. I know how much that affected my ability to socialise, to make long-term friends. You want to subject your child to that? You know, I certainly don't advocate it. That responsibility's on you. But the point being is, you're right. When we were in Winton, when we were 20 years old, didn't have a kid to worry about. So yeah, could sleep in my car, could travel wherever I want, could do whatever I want. Jesus, if I didn't want to work, I didn't affect anyone either. I was solely responsible for my own welfare. Could drink piss every night and wake up with a splitting headache and a hangover. The only person I'm hurting is me, not anyone else. That's sort of my point, Bill. The point is, you know, you had the freedom to move around and chase work then, just as I did, because you did not have to take into consideration the welfare of others. That situation applied to you and to me, not to anyone else necessarily. There are people out there who are 20 years of age who have a child, who have to consider the welfare of the child. There are people 20 years of age who have a partner that have to consider their partner's welfare and their ability to support their partner, or their ability of their partner to relocate. You know, you're right. We didn't have a partner, we didn't have a child. I'm really trying to understand what's your point. That was sort of the point I was making. We had the flexibility to do it because we didn't have any obligation to be preoccupied with the welfare of others. That is sort of the point. Your circumstance is your circumstance. Mine is mine. You are not a single mother. You weren't a single mother when you were 20, I'm fucking sure of it. Because if you were a rather disturbing woman. But, I mean, that's sort of the point, mate. I'm really struggling to understand where you're coming from with this. I'm really trying to understand where you're coming from this. But anyway, okay, so, you know. Now, you go on. To answer your question, no, I haven't always had access to reliable transportation. Sometimes I walk to work. Yeah, guess what? So did I. Yes, I've had injuries that have impaired my ability to work. But as soon as I recovered, I went back to work. Did you disclose those injuries to your ongoing employers? Were they potentially injuries that may have caused concern for litigation for those employers? Or, you know, questions about your ability to perform your job? I'm not saying they are or not. I'm just curious, right? You were diagnosed with social anxiety disorder about 10 years ago. Well, throw your hands up, dude. You're not the only one. I continue to take medication to this day to treat condition. Guess what? You're probably on Citrona, same as me. Fantastic. I'm glad you're looking after yourself, and I mean that, genuinely. This is not a personal attack. I'm just trying to understand why you think the way you do, and why you have the attitude you do. You say, I've lost a few cars, rental properties due to different circumstances, and no, I was not the sole parent to a child. Guess what? Yeah, I've lost cars. I've had cars go up in flames. I've had cars get smashed. You know, I've lost rental properties for many of different reasons. And unlike you, I have been a single sole parent to a child. I have. I really have. And I can tell you it's a lot fucking different than, you know, not being in that situation. You go on. Having said all that, I continue to keep working different jobs and moving forward. Congratulations. Awesome. That's what everyone should do, if they can. If people are going to sit at home making up excuses why they can't find work, then they never will find work. Hey, I agree with you. Fantastic. And if you're just left with that point, oh, dude. The wonderful thing about the human condition is that people have the ability to change their situation should they choose to. If they are caring for an elderly family member, then they should try accessing a carer's pension. Then they are exempt from looking for work. Now here's where you start diverging from things a little bit. Okay, first of all, yes, most of us have the ability to change our circumstance. With some cravats. You know, it's sort of like suggesting that someone in a country, in a famine-struck country, can change their living circumstances. Sure, Hard work, determination, willpower will get you a long way, but you are still confined to the framework with which you're surrounded. You know, you could be born with spina bifida. It never means you're going to be a marathon runner. I don't care how much willpower you have, and it's not a criticism on anyone who's disabled. Right? You can have all the willpower in the world. You can have the determination. You can have the willingness to do what it takes. But unfortunately, circumstances are conspiring against you. And the likelihood of that being successful is extraordinarily slim. But hey, stem cell research is a thing. But here's the thing. You go on to say, if someone is caring for an elderly family member, then they should try accessing a carer's pension. Then they are exempt from looking for work. Yes? Correct. But you are aware, of course, that a carer's pension is also a Centerlink benefit. And you never specified that your conversation about people complaining with regards to how livable Centerlink benefits are excludes someone who's on a carer's pension. Are you even aware of how much a carer's pension earns? Do you know how much it costs to look after someone who's infirmed or debilitated? I actually don't know. I'm not even going to say. I could look it up, but I'm not going to right now. But I really want to know, do you know? Do you know what it costs for the average person to look after someone full time who's infirmed or debilitated in some way? And do you know how much they receive from Centerlink through a carer's pension? Because if you don't, then I don't think you have any more authority to speak on the subject than I do. And I certainly don't think it disqualifies those people from having a legitimate avenue for complaining about the livability of financial assistance from Centerlink. But anyway, we'll go on. Someone who is on Newstart allowance refusing to look for work because their grandparents are old should have their allowances cut, plain and simple. Oh, Jesus fucking Christ, Bill. Really? So your answer is, okay, we'll put this in context for you. So your grandparents, presumably they worked very hard, I'm sure. Very hard. They paid tax. They did everything to support, you know, your mother, your father, to raise them, to provide them with safe and secure home, all these sorts of things. No doubt they even tried their best to look after you as grandparents and to guide you and to, you know, do what they can to help your life. And what you're suggesting is that those old grandparents of yours, and God, I don't know whether I feel good or bad whether they're still around, but you know, those grandparents, you know, in their old age, after they have sacrificed so much of their own life to provide for your parents and for you and for the tax system and for community in general, that, you know, they should just not matter. Shouldn't matter. You know, they're getting old. They're becoming frail. That's the nature of things. They might still be able to work. I mean, look, I know people who are in their 60s and 70s who still work. But to suggest that they have full mobility or they're capable of, you know, dealing with an accident if it happens is a little bit misguided. Does that mean that they are on disability benefits? No, not at all. I actually volunteer at the Man Shed here in Longreach. Most of the people who attend are 20 years my senior. Some of them are even healthier than me, I would suggest. But I can tell you this, the vast majority of the people who come to the Man Shed, they're not on disability pension. right? However, if they were to fall over and injure themselves, they would be in quite dire straits. It doesn't mean that they don't benefit from the assistance that someone else can give them, even if they're not injured. I'm there to help them. If they want to turn wood, I help. I don't know a damn thing about turning wood. I'm not even that particularly interested in turning wood, right? But I'm there to help them. Does that mean that they have a disability and can't do it? No. But does it mean that they don't benefit from me being there and helping them? Oh, of course they do. You know, and that only becomes more and more prevalent as they get older. One of the gentlemen can barely walk. To the best of my knowledge, he's not on disability pension. Maybe he is. I'd have to ask Noel, to be honest. But, you know, I assist him to walk in and out. He can walk. He's got a cane. He does walk, but it takes about 15 minutes for him to get from the man shed to the car. He's capable of eating. He's capable of, you know, doing all those things you would expect a person to be able to do to look after themselves for the most part. But does it not cause distress upon him? Sure. Is it not difficult for him? Sure. And here's the thing. You're saying that if your grandparents were in that same situation and they had the opportunity to have the assistance of your parents or yourself or anyone else who was of working age to assist them in their later life as a form of respect to them for contributing so much to society, to your life, to your parents' life, to the tax system, to the workforce, they should be just left to their own devices. And, you know, they should not be a consideration at all for anyone who may want to stay there and assist their parents or their grandparents later in life in the pursuit of a job. My father's retired. I don't know if your father is, I don't know if your father, I don't even know if they're alive. Whatever, that's for you. But my father's retired. He is the only parent I have in my life. I have nothing to do with my mother. He's also the most significant person in my life before my daughter. Why? Because he has supported me my whole life. He has been there for me when I've needed it. Now, to suggest in some way that I'm less of a person because I do consider the fact that he's only just in Winton, only 179 kilometres away, and that if he needs me, I'm nearby. To suggest that I don't keep that in mind and have that as a consideration, given that he's getting older, when I'm looking for work, is probably the single most insulting thing I've ever heard from an individual towards my father. Doesn't bother me, because I really don't care what your opinion is at this point. At this point, I'm pretty certain that your opinion and mine aren't going to meet, and that's fine. But I find it insulting for my father. He's worked his entire life. He has worked longer than you. He has given more of himself for the workforce and the tax system than you have. He has injured himself probably far more than you have, or certainly more than you allude to in your posts. He's now of an age where he's retired. He does not have any other family around him. He has me and he has my daughter. We're in Longreach, he's in Winton. And if you remember, that's 179 kilometres away. He has no other family anywhere near him. The next closest family would be Brisbane, which is what, 1,000 kilometres? So if my dad has an emergency, needs assistance, or wants to see his family, he can drive here, and he does regularly, about once a month, to come and see my daughter and come and see me. Or we can drive to Winton and see him. You know, as he gets older, you know, and because he's obviously not married anymore. A lot of his friends are dying, moving on, or moved away. He's become increasingly isolated in some ways. His self-esteem has been affected. I know this. He doesn't talk about it because he's my father, and what would you expect? But I know it's affected him because I've seen it. I've seen the same symptoms that I've suffered from. And when you see how important it is for him to be able to come and see my daughter easily, to take that away from him, to suggest to him that his contribution to the world means nothing because you feel that it invalidates my concern and I should just relocate to anywhere in the world, or Australia, or whatever, it doesn't really matter, for a job without considering my responsibility to him and his welfare and his self-esteem and his emotional state, really shows the type of person you are. It really does. I can't really paint it any clearer. I'll read it again. Someone who was on Newstart allowance, refusing to look for work because their grandparents are old, should have their allowances cut, plain and simple. Well, yeah, refusing to look for work. I understand that. But you've made it very clear that you don't really make the distinction between refusing to look for work and taking whatever work's available. That you feel that any job is valid. That people should even relocate to get work. And if they don't, that they really don't, they don't have the right to suggest that it is a struggle to live off Centerlink benefits in circumstances. So I'm really puzzled by that, and a little bit disconcerted, to be perfectly honest, because it really does sound like you have no consideration for any other single human being but yourself. I hope that's not the case. And as I said, this isn't intended as a personal attack. I'm really trying to understand where your attitude is coming from and what logic it makes to you, because it doesn't make a lot of logic to me. I'll be honest about it. It doesn't make any logic to me at all. In fact, as I said, at this point in this conversation, I've really become acutely aware of the fact that I don't think either of us are ever going to see eye to eye on this particular issue, and I don't particularly care. I'm more interested in having a conversation about it. We can both become entrenched in the fact that you believe this and I believe that, and we can sprout at each other all the time, but it's not practical. I want to actually understand. I want to drill down to why you believe these things. And, later in the conversation, I ask you, what are those things? You don't really reveal what they are, but anyway, that's later on. Anyway, so we'll continue on. You go on, you say, parents who sit on Centerlink payments refusing to work are only instilling that the world owes them a living into their children. I think that's a little bit too broad a statement, mate. For starters, you're suggesting that all parents are the same. And all parents' circumstances are the same. Later on in the conversation, I talk about, single mothers who leave abusive relationships. You don't think that there's any value to them staying at home and maintaining a stable, comforting, secure environment for their child who may have been subjected to some of the ramifications of that abuse? If a child has seen abuse in the family and that parent leaves with that child, I certainly wouldn't begrudge them the opportunity to be on Centerlink and not be preoccupied about getting a job. I would want them to spend as much time as they can with that child to instill in that child a sense of safety and security and stability until they feel confident enough to in their child's welfare to continue on to work. But no, apparently all parents who sit around on Centerlink refusing to pay work, refusing to work, are only instilling the world owes them a living. That Can you... There's a good question. Now, do you honestly feel that if a 3-year-old has seen their mother physically assaulted, abused and beaten, regardless of whether the child's been physically assaulted or not, but the wife's been physically assaulted, there's been yelling, there's been screaming, there's been distress in the home, and that wife chooses to leave that circumstance with the child for the child's safety. They then go on Centerlink payments because, you know, they can't work. They've got a 3-year-old. As a concerned parent, they left that environment because they want to safeguard their child. Their child is exhibiting signs of anxiety and distress because of the circumstances. Not only have they just lost one of their parents because they've been relocated away from that parent, regardless of whether they're abusive or not, that is a significant thing. And 2, they've witnessed quite a distressing situation. Do you really believe that that parent is trying to instill in their child that the world owes them a living? You don't see any other reason why that parent may feel compelled not to look for work, but to try and provide safe harbour for their child without further conflict of, oh no, mummy's gone to work, oh no, where is mummy? Suddenly being left with, you know, a third party, complete strangers, childcare, whatever it may be. You really think that? If you don't, that's fine. I want you to explain it, or I want someone to explain it, but that's certainly not what's written, or not how I interpret it. I can tell you from my own personal experience that when my daughter was taken away from me, against her will, and against my consent, I was her full-time carer. Her mother, my partner at the time, on average, really only got to see her 4 hours a day, at the most. The rest of the time she spent working. Working. Not begrudging that, not interested in pulling that situation up. But when my daughter was removed away from me, against her will, she suffered incredible anxiety, incredible stress. She had panic attacks. So bad, in fact, that when I did eventually get to see my daughter again and she would come here and sleep, she wouldn't even let me go to the toilet with the door shut. Because if she could not see me, she would have full-blown panic attacks. She would start crying and screaming. I would tell her, sweetie, daddy's going outside, I'm going to hang out some clothing on the clothesline outside. I would be outside less than 2 minutes and she would be outside barefooted and half-dressed, screaming and crying because she's panicking. That's something she didn't do before then. I would have to shower, go to the toilet, cook dinner, everything else, and she would have to be able to see me. If she couldn't see me, she would panic. Guess what, Bill? You know what my preoccupation at the time was? It wasn't looking for work. I'll be honest. I wasn't looking for work at the time. I had no interest in getting a job at the time. It's not because I didn't want to work. It's because my focus was wholly and solely on the welfare of my daughter. She barely got to see me. When she did, she was in such distress, I had to take her up to the hospital. I had to take her to community health to try and find ways to manage her stress, her distress, her panic, her anxiety. She would wake up in the middle of the night screaming. She would, if she couldn't find me or feel me, she would lose it. She was 6. She's 7 now. She's better. But she was 6. Do you honestly think that I felt that the world owes me, or that I'm trying to teach my daughter that, you know, the world owes us something for nothing? No. Quite frankly, I never even thought about it because it wasn't important to me. It might be important to you because clearly you are anxious and seemingly in a in a situation where you feel there's such scarcity about you, about the money in the world or anything like whatever it may be. I don't know, but there's clearly something motivating you to be the way you are. But no, I didn't give a shit about a job. In fact, to be honest, if at the time someone had offered me a job, I probably would have declined, unless I felt confident that I could do that job and still look after the welfare of my child. Because at that time, my sole motivation was to spend as much time as I possibly could with my daughter, to give her a sense of safety, security, and to reaffirm to her that Daddy was not going anywhere, and that Daddy was not leaving, Daddy was not going to disappear. Now imagine if I went to work and she was terrified that I was going to disappear at the time. Imagine if I went to work. No worries, sweetie, it's all right. You go to childcare. Daddy's going to work. Whee! Holy shit, dude. If that is your attitude, then, to a large extent, I feel somewhat of a reprieve that we're not really talking. We're not really friends. We haven't really spoken in 20 years because, quite frankly, you're not the sort of person that I would want around my daughter. It baffles me. It really baffles me. But anyway, we'll go on. You say, I work 2-1 rosters away from my family. To put that in simple terms, I get to spend about 1/3 of a year at home with my wife and son. I do this to provide for my family with a home and a decent standard of living. Should it be required, I would pack up my family and move somewhere else to continue to do that to maintain our lifestyle. To see my son, see my wife and I as hardworking. Hey, good, more power to you. I'm not trying to take anything away from you. That's commendable. You'll see later, I've actually done 21 days and 7 days off. I didn't have a family at the time, so, I was responsible for myself. I wasn't being away from a family at the time. So I understand what it's like to do rosters away. I really do. I worked on the Bohemia Regional Rail Project as a surveyor. 21 days on, 12 hours a day, living at camp, 7 days in town. Been there. I hate to tell you, living away is not unique to you. But I commend you for being able to do that with your family. And more importantly, I commend your family for being amenable to that. If your wife and your daughter, or your son, if they're dealing with that situation, well, good. But I certainly wouldn't begrudge you if your son or your wife were not dealing with that situation in a healthy way. If they were having anxiety or mental stress or anything like that because you're away, I certainly wouldn't begrudge you if you chose not to do work away, and you chose rather to focus on the mental health of your family. I certainly wouldn't begrudge it. Don't know if anyone else will. But anyway, let's go down a bit. Okay. Now, a lot of this I've probably already gone over, but here's my response. You are correct. There is financial assistance for moving costs if it is for employment after you have the job. In my experience, employers prefer resumes from locals unless it is for specialised work. My experience, yep. I don't know too many people here that take resumes from Emerald for people to work at the local Prices Plus or IGA or shop, Target, whatever. Why? Because they want someone local, right? Not the least of which because in smaller towns like this, yeah, it's important to try and support local people. But more importantly, they want someone who has ties here that isn't going to feel compelled to move away. And this is one of the crux issues you have with some employers. If an employer is willing to take on someone who moves from outside the locale into town for that job, they also do that with the understanding that if a better job comes up outside of that town, that person will leave. Why? Because they're following the work. There's nothing wrong with that. But as an employer, they have to weigh that risk. The risk is that if someone hasn't been in a particular place for a long time and they are moving strictly to that place for working reasons, if better opportunities come or if the work dries up, they will move away. Which does put some concern on their reliability for long-term employment, if an employer wants to do that. If an employer wants someone they can rely on for the next 5-6 years, and they manage to pull in someone from out of town, and it's not a specialised position where there's a highly skilled or specified skill set involved, then they have to understand that there is a potential that this person, with the possibility of better employment coming up elsewhere, they will leave, which leaves that employer in the same position of looking to refill that same position. This is something that I used to address as a business coach, because there are a lot of businesses that have very low retention rates. Some of it's industry specific, and some of it is to do with their recruiting mechanisms. Some businesses will recruit regardless of the locale of the potential employee. That's understandable, especially if you need the particular skills that those people provide. And certainly as an employer, you want the best qualified for that job. But then I have worked with businesses that were surprised that they were then unable to retain a lot of that staff long term. The reason being is because these determined people who came from outside of the area and relocated there specifically for that job, when they were given an opportunity, a better opportunity or a competitive opportunity, they moved. They moved either because the job was better, good to them, you know, it's a good prospect, or they simply preferred to live somewhere else and a comparable job came up. This is why a lot of people want to live on the coast, not out in rural areas. Because who wants to live somewhere where there's relatively little choice in shops, in entertainment, in any of those sorts of things, when if the same job is available on the coast, you could be near the beach, near, you know, a wider choice of entertainment, live bands, any of that sort of stuff. So it's not surprising, it's just the nature of business. But as I said, an employer who is self-aware, who is educated and thoughtful and pragmatic, will recognise that there is a risk to employing someone who is not local to the business in those circumstances. I'll go on. I've also experienced the added complexity and difficulty in competing for a prospective job when you are not local to the premises, particularly with regards to the interview process. True. At one point I was unemployed and actually maintained 2 houses, one in Gladstone and one in Rockhampton, 2 residential places, and I was looking for work in both places, and I can tell you that was difficult because I drove a lot, and ultimately the only job I got was the meatworks job in Rockhampton. I can tell you that, and I've applied for other work. I mean, you've been in the mining industry, and if you don't know, engineering is part of the mining industry, it's certainly related to it. We used to work with BSL and the like, right? Now, you would know as well as anyone that a lot of that work is not local to where most people live. It's fly in, fly out. It's that sort of thing. I've applied for those jobs. I know the difficulty in them. I know also the difficulty in ongoing employment with those sorts of places, and some of the issues that come with some of the resentment that comes from locals, of foreigners, of people, non-locals coming in and taking their work, of inflating their economy in their town. I know this. I've dealt with this. This is something that I've taught about. This is something that I've coached about. So yeah, I know how difficult it is. I had that experience in competing for prospective jobs that aren't local. I've travelled hundreds of kilometres for interviews, only to not get the job, and in other cases I have got the job. I do feel that a Centerlink recipient, I'll rephrase it, sorry. I'll go on. So I say, do you feel that a Centerlink recipient should be obligated to travel 300 plus kilometres both ways for an interview for a prospective job because they're unable to get a job locally? I ask that because here in Longreach, you've got Barcaldine, which is 100 kilometres one way, and you've got Winton, which is 170 kilometres another way, and honestly, probably the closest place with potentially a higher employment prospect would be Emerald, which is about 300 kilometres away, and you would know that, or you should remember that, right? So potentially you're asking someone in this area, if they're unable to secure work either here in Longreach or Winton or Barcaldine, to drive to Emerald for an interview and then turn around and drive back, which you can do in one day, and we have done it. But that's why I ask. I go on. If yes, then would you not think that the current income supplied by Centerlink for most people would be inadequate to cover those expenses? It's a pretty simple question. Particularly if they required someone to look after a small child while they're away. If you have a toddler or someone in school, if I had to go for an interview during a work day for a prospective job in Emerald, I would have to have someone here to pick up my daughter. Someone I trust, mind you, but someone to pick up my daughter. Because I could not drive to Emerald in time for an interview, turn around and drive back, and still be here in Longreach to drop her off to school or pick her up. I would have to leave before she got to school, and I'd come back before she, after she got out of school. She wouldn't see me between 5 in the morning and I think it was like 6 at night, 7 at night, something like that. Last time we went to Emerald. So you have to understand. I mean, short of family members or friends, I have to pay someone to look after my daughter while I travel to Emerald for an interview, mind you. Not a job, for an interview. For a prospective job to meet your requirements. But that's fine, but then the question is, don't you think that if Centerlink is paying just enough to get by, that money is inadequate to expect someone to then be able to do that? To be able to pay someone to look after a child and travel 600 kilometres round trip, give or take, for a single day, for an interview. And yes, later on you mentioned you can do interviews over the phone. Sure you can. But I can tell you now, as someone who's done business coaching, as someone who's owned businesses, as someone who has managed businesses, most employers prefer face-to-face interviews. Bill, do you know why? Body language is very telling in interviews. It's very easy for the average employer to be misled about the type of person they are dealing with over the phone. Just the same reason why they don't do interviews over email. And the fact that you would even suggest that really shows how far removed you are from the reality of the situation. You're trying to tell me that you're experienced, you're knowledgeable, and you understand the situation, and I'm pretty sure if I asked your boss whether he would prefer to interview someone in person or over the phone and gauge how trustworthy they would feel about one over the other, I think you would very quickly see the dilemma that most employers face with over the phone interviews. But we'll go on. How does an unemployed person cover the expense of breaking a lease, relocating, securing rental if Centerlink is just enough to get by? Seems like a pretty reasonable question. I know lots of people, I know even from personal experience when working, that the expense of breaking a lease, raising bond, advance in rent, transport, relocation expenses is a lot, even when you're working. Even when you have savings. Even when you can rely upon a credit card or a loan. So I'm really trying to understand, if Centerlink is just enough to get by, how does an unemployed person cover those expenses? You've already stated repeatedly that you're not going to do it. And that's fine. I'm not asking you for a handout. It was never the intent, and it's certainly not the crux of my point. The point is, if they can't afford it themselves, and you're not volunteering to do it, then how are these people supposed to meet your expectations? It really does defy logic to me. Again, if someone can prove, if someone can sort of break that down and show me how that does make sense, please do. I really want to know. I genuinely want to know. As I say, you certainly are not putting your hand up to do so. So how does an unemployed person do it in a short time frame with a limited ability to save money on an income that's just enough to get by? It's not about handouts, as stated before. You will always find someone abusing the system. It is about expectations placed on by some on the unemployed. Now, if you haven't worked it out, I was talking about you. To relocate in order to work when most, if not all, don't have the means. Short of a GoFundMe, and if you don't know what a GoFundMe is, Google it. But short of a GoFundMe, I don't see how expecting someone to travel hundreds of kilometres for interviews for prospective jobs in unfamiliar locations while supporting dependents is at all realistic. I think I've explained that. If not, I'll probably keep going, know what I'm like. But anyway, I do think it's unrealistic. I would love to get feedbacks from locals about how they would feel with non-locals taking up their local jobs if successful. And I ask that because, as I said, I've been a party to the mining industry. I've been a party to the engineering industry. I've been party to the fly in, fly out. I've been party to the work away, the camp work. I'm very familiar with some of the resentment that's generated by locals when outsiders come in, take up the jobs, inflate the cost of living, particularly in some of these rural towns, and then when that particular project is over, leaving, only for the town to crash. You got people who can't afford rent in some of these places because the sheer volume of workers that enter into these rural areas to work inflate the costs, inflate the rental costs. So locals can't afford it. And then they leave. A lot of these people don't even contribute long term to the economy. Certainly most of these people who do travel from outside of the locality to that particular area to work have done so to work. So as soon as that work is gone, as soon as that contract, that project is over, they leave. They don't have any intention on staying. Again, this is something that local employers have to consider when employing someone from outside the locality. I'll go on. Currently the West has been in drought and many businesses and jobs have closed. Should all those people who can no longer find work here relocate to the coast? Seems like a legitimate question. That's apparently where all the work is. Certainly not out here, as I said. Drought. Loss of businesses, loss of jobs. How should they feel that now either they or their children are competing harder against more people who arrive to town or the coast for the same limited number of jobs? You've got to keep in mind, Bill, there's unemployed people out here ruling. There's unemployed people on the coast. There is more job opportunities on the coast, typically. So if you have people from rural areas, like Longreach, who relocate to the coast, where there is potentially more jobs available to them, you've now increased the competition for those jobs. That's probably a healthy thing, but it's also not a very practical one, because you haven't resolved the issue, in as much as you now have more people competing for the same number of jobs. The same number of jobs that have always existed in that position. But instead, now you have not only people, but potentially their children who are growing up after them and entering the workforce, competing in ever harder situation, competing more desperately for the same jobs. Not only that, you're flooding the area with a high number of people in potentially places with low number of housing availability. So again, you're potentially inflating rent. You're inflating the cost of residential rent. Because if you have 10 people looking for the same house because they want to relocate there because there's work, and there's only one house available, guess what? Like any market, the housing market is on supply and demand. If there is a higher demand than there is supply, cost of rent goes up. Did you even think about that? Have you even thought that through? I know what the answer is. I can see that clearly from the way you've written things. But I really want you to take a moment and think about these things. Because this entrenched thinking that you have, that every answer is, fuck you, get a job, go relocate, fuck you, get a job, really does sort of, to me, highlight the disparity there between the reality of the situation and what your expectation is. So I'm going to do one more, and then I'm going to stop, and then I'll have to do a part 2. Or maybe more, because apparently I'm going to talk. So your responses to what I said, is the short answer to what you pose is yes. If there is no work available in the area, then go somewhere where there is work. The interview process can be done over the phone if need be. Some employers will accept that and some will not. Correct? But as I said, you haven't addressed some of the concerns that employers would have, and one of the reasons why that has a tendency to be less effective for people pursuing work, doing interviews over the phone. Unless it's specialised work. Specialised work always has a tendency to be the exception because you have skills that are in demand. There are programs available to assist in relocating as far as housing and living costs and childcare. Correct. But as I said before, the assistance in relocating as far as housing and living costs is on a guarantee of work. That means you must already have the job. That means not only do you have to do the interview over the phone if you can't travel that distance, but that employer must accept you for that job, have a written guarantee of work to submit to Centerlink in order for Centerlink to then subsidise or assist you in relocating for that job. Quick question, Bill. Go ask your boss how likely he would be to do that. Because I asked you to do that, and your response was, oh, go fuck yourself. Basically, I asked you, later on in this conversation, to go talk to your boss, to ask if he would be willing to provide a guarantee of employment, because from what you tell me, he's scrambling for workers. If he's scrambling for workers and he wants a highly skilled employee who has experience, I'm here. I'm available. The only thing I need, and the only impediment to going and working for him, is I need in writing a guarantee of work so I can submit that to Centerlink so that I can get the financial assistance required to relocate. Without that, I would need to rely upon, oh my God, the charity of others. Does that mean you're going to put your hand up and pay for it, Bill? Because, as I said, I've been facetious, but I've asked repeatedly, and you could go, I'm no fucking handouts, no fucking handouts. So you know what 1 plus 1 is, don't you? It's 2. So if you take 1 away, it doesn't equal 2. So if you want money for people to go travel to a job, then you have to have money come from somewhere for these people to go get a job. If they can't get it from Centerlink, because it's only just enough to get by, it's got to get from somewhere. It can't come from a bank because, as established before, banks don't give you a loan if you're unemployed. And we know, okay, well maybe we don't know, but if you like, go and ask your boss. Ask your boss, would he be willing to pay 2 weeks advanced wages to me to relocate to go work? So he gives me those 2 weeks wages before I've started so that I have the money to relocate to that job. I then do 2 weeks without pay because he's already paid me, he's paid me in advance. And then we just keep going. Ask him if he'll do it. Honestly, Bill, I've done business coaching. I've done this more than you can even imagine. I already know what the answer is. If your boss actually says, yes, please give me his number. Please give me his number. Give me his details, because I will applaud him and I will respect him for it. But I can tell you, in my lifetime of coaching businesses, this is not common practice. In fact, I've never known it to exist, unless it is for a skilled, specialized position, for someone who is postgraduate, or someone who has a specific skill set that is in high demand and low supply. So, hey, ball's in your court, mate. You want to ask your boss? Go for it. Because I really fucking want to know. I really genuinely want to know. Not only that, I want to know if you have the balls to fucking ask your boss, honestly, because I don't think you've got the fucking balls. I don't think you've thought what you've written down out fully. I don't think you really understand the reality of the situation. And I don't think you are taking the time to read what I have written in response to you clearly, because at this point in the conversation you have started to repeat things that I've already addressed, such as, you know, the programs available in assisting relocating as far as housing and living costs. I already mentioned that. That was several paragraphs ago where we talked about guarantee of work. So I don't quite understand why you've brought it up again, since I've already addressed that, unless you aren't actually reading through what I'm saying. And that's fine if that's your case. You know, I don't expect anyone to sit through this shit the way I do anyway. But I just find that, I actually find that fucking amusing, to be honest. But I would, you know, again, this isn't a personal attack. I'm not trying to browbeat you or anything, Bill. I'm just trying to understand where your attitude comes from. I'm trying to understand why you think the way you do. Because I can tell you, in my experience, and at this point I'm pretty confident my experience exceeds yours by far, but in my experience you have defaulty thinking with regards to that. You simply either do not have enough evidence or enough experience to really understand what you're talking about. But I'll go on. So, you go on and you say, why would I put my hands up to assist someone who doesn't want to change their circumstance? Hey, that's fair. If someone doesn't want to change their circumstance, I wouldn't expect anyone to fucking help. You can't help someone who is unwilling to help themselves. That's sort of not the point, Bill. The point is, you are lumping all unemployed people on Centerlink benefits into the same basket and suggesting they all don't want help, that they all don't want assistance, that they all don't want to change their circumstances. And you know as well as I do, Bill, you've even admitted this in your conversation, that is not the case. So it's not a matter of why would you put your hand up to assist someone who doesn't want to change their circumstance. The question is, why wouldn't you assist someone who wants to change their circumstance? Regardless of whether it's by volunteering to help yourself, whether that is, as we'll see later in the conversation, where you pass on a potential employee's details to your employer because they're looking for work, or by accepting the fact that a portion of your tax goes towards trying to assist those people in getting into work. And if it isn't enough, then that needs to be addressed. You go on. You point out the drought and lack of work. But why should hard-working taxpayers be paying Newstart allowance to someone who wants to remain in an area where work prospects are slim to none? I really want to understand why you think you're the lone wolf here. You seem to keep talking about hard-working taxpayers as like you're the only one. That all these people in Longreach here, who no longer have a job, haven't worked or contributed to the tax system. I'm really trying to understand that. There are, as I said, I've been at the man shed. I volunteer at the man shed. They're all 20 years my senior. They've been in the workforce longer than you, Bill. There's a high likelihood they've paid more tax than you. There's a high likelihood that they are responsible for more benefits that you have received through the tax system than you have for them. And yet you're saying, boo-hoo, bad drought, why should we pay for them to be supported? That's part of the system, Bill. It's called Social Security for a reason. These people who have worked very hard all their lives in jobs that I doubt even you or I would want to do sometimes, have worked very hard and now have found themselves in a position where they no longer can work because cattle is dying on their farm. That they no longer have work because their customers can't afford to buy locally. They've become entrenched by automation. And yet the way you word things, you make it sound like you are part of a select group of taxpayers paying that Newstart allowance. Do you honestly think that what you pay in tax is exclusively you? I mean, do you not recognise that those people who are not just in the workforce now, but who were in the workforce previously have contributed to that tax system, to that same system that provides you with Medicare, that provides you with pension, all these sorts of things. That money, it's not like they pull that money out every day, Bill, and go, okay, this money that come in from tax today is for everyone today. It goes into a big pool, Bill, a big pool of money. It's what's called a budget. It goes in a big pool of money. Some of that money, who knows? It could have been in there for years, decades even. Who knows? Who really knows and who really cares? The point being is, you are disrespecting those people who have worked hard for those social security benefits before you, longer than you. And yet here you are telling them, why should I fucking give you any of my hard-earned tax money to pay for your assistance? I can't possibly think of a more insulting thing for everyone who's your senior. I can't possibly think of anything more insulting for anyone who is your peer, who previously worked and no longer can work for whatever circumstances it is. I can't think of anything more insulting to me, and I really don't care. But honestly, you know, I've had back injuries. I've done more work for you. I've done more work in probably more industry than you have. I think that's pretty clear from the level of knowledge that you have. And yet to somehow suggest that, you know, why should you pay for Social Security to support those people who no longer can work or can't work in the short term is somehow a burden on you, really You know, imagine if that went the other way. Imagine if these people said, why should our hard-earned taxes pay for Mr. Amos's schooling? Why should our hard-earned taxes pay for the roads that he drives on? We're not fucking using them. I'm pretty sure most of the people here at the Man Shed don't live in fucking South Australia, dude. So why should they be paying tax into the road, into that big pool of money that's for the roads built in South Australia? Because it certainly doesn't affect them slightest. Why would all these people have worked so hard and in a lot of cases under great duress to contribute to the tax system to pay for your education, if not at least in part, and to support you when you were on the dole? And then for you to turn around and say, well, why should my taxpayer fucking money be supporting them? I mean, honestly, if there's anyone who has if there's anyone who can break this down in a logical way for me in the comments, please do it, because I honestly, this seems so far removed from anything that makes any sense to me. I'm really genuinely trying to understand how this sort of thinking works. But we'll go on. You then say, yes, it would, you go on to say, yes, it would affect the local economy, but that's the way of life in remote towns. They boom and they bust. Repeat. Yeah, it's the same as industries too. I've been in 3 industries that have collapsed. One actually collapsed twice. I was in the telecommunications industry when we had an analog network, mobile network. I can tell you the arse fell out of that when we went digital, because the competition ramped up so quickly and there were so many competitors that it became increasingly less profitable to do. And ultimately, as you no doubt know yourself, there's not that many now. There's like 3 or 4 major competitors. But when I was in there was about 20 to 30. Yep. And that industry, sort of like the console wars for gaming. It too much competition and it fell on its arse. But it came back. And that's what I managed my last job. I managed a telecommunications shop. And progressively got squeezed out of that by suppliers, by Telstra in particular, because they continued to decrease the revenue that partners were entitled to through sales, and continue to push people online, which ultimately squeezed out a lot of those partner dealerships, like ourselves. So yeah, industry that's fallen on its ass twice. Well, maybe not industry as such, but certainly job prospects within those particular industries. As I said, I joined Q-Link, job for life. Well, I don't even know where to start with that, dude. I'm pretty sure everyone I worked with at Q-Link didn't have a job at Q-Link at least 10 years after I fucking left. At this point, I don't think Q-Link even exists. I'm pretty sure it's Azuron now. The Meatworks was the same. As I said, when I first moved to Rockhampton, everyone said, "You gotta get in the Meatworks, dude. Big money, good job. You can have it, yeah. You'll always have a job if you're willing to work." Now, for whatever reason, when I first got there, I couldn't get a job at the Meatworks. Could not. I could barely get a fucking look in. But after the global economic crisis, and BSL and the other mines went quiet, and engineering projects shut down, and there was a large jettison of workforce in the engineering sector, which technically I suppose would be a contraction of that industry. It was the only job I could get. And I got there, and guess what? The first 2 weeks I was there, I was told so many times it's not what it was, because of those 457s and the fact that the going rate for a paid workforce had gone down. The conditions had become far more competitive, and it simply was not a job that had any long-term security to it anymore. So, and I'm not complaining about that. That's just it. I found it unfair at the time, and to some extent, You know, to some extent, some of it was quite frustrating and irritating and annoying to me. But the short answer is, it's just the nature of things. But yeah, I mean, towns, they boom, they bust, so do industries. I don't quite understand why that somehow deflects your sense of hardship that people might experience, or compassion for the circumstance that they might be in, certainly if they're far more extreme than your circumstance. You go on to say, Centerlink payments are a safety net to help keep you going while looking for employment, but they are not a way of life. The bottom line is, and the point I was making, is that if you can't survive on Centerlink payments, then get a job and support yourself. If not, be quiet and be grateful you get something courtesy of hard-working Australians who will not accept that sitting at home complaining that Centerlink doesn't give them enough. We all have the ability to make a change if we want to. Okay, now at this point, I'm going to address this, and at this point I'm going to stop because I think we're broaching on 3 hours. And I'll keep going, I'll make another video. But here's the thing, you're right, Centerlink, the intention is to be a safety net to keep you going while looking for employment. You'll see later on in the conversation, I give you direct facts and figures from the Australian Government, Bureau of Statistics, as well as other particular resources, that clearly state that in our job market, there are 15 people plus competing for every single one job. What that means is, even if every single person, regardless of whether they were qualified for the job or not, if every single person who was unemployed tried to get a job tomorrow and those that applied were successful, there would still be 14 times the number of jobs filled unemployed, because there simply aren't enough jobs for everyone. There aren't. It's a harsh fact, Bill, an unfair one to some extent for those who are unemployed, but it is a fact nonetheless. It's a fact that the government recognises, writes down. It's in the Australian Bureau of Statistics. If every single person, if they suddenly said, hey, it doesn't matter whether you have qualifications to be a doctor, you can be a doctor. And I applied to be a doctor tomorrow and I got the job. And every unemployed person was in that same situation. You still would have a large portion of the population who would remain unemployed. Not because they don't want to work, but because there simply are not enough jobs. Now, if this is the case, Bill, and it is, the facts and figures don't lie. That's why we have an unemployment rate, Bill. It's what's part of the budget, Bill. And here's the thing. If this is the case, then I really want to know why then that takes away the right for someone who was faced with that sort of circumstance to say, I am struggling with what I'm getting from Centerlink. You are right, it's supposed to be a safety net. But the reality is that statistically it is impossible for every unemployed person to become employed. There are simply not enough jobs. Regardless of their skill or regardless of their willingness to work. Which means that even if half of those people who are unemployed willingly want to work, Bill, the vast majority of them statistically are unlikely to ever get a job because there's simply not enough jobs for them, given the number, given the facts and figures. So I really want to know that if that's the case, why then do you feel that in some way takes away their right to say, I am struggling to get by on what I am getting on Centerlink, and it is a struggle. You're telling them to shut the fuck up. Harden the fuck up, buttercup. Move on. Which I gotta say is probably the most amusing thing about you, is you keep telling these people to shut up and harden the fuck up if they don't like, you know, if they're going to complain about the situation. And yet this whole conversation right here is born out of the fact that you couldn't shut the fuck up and you had to complain about people who are in a circumstance that you're not in. That you had to paint these people in a way that says, suck it up, buttercup. Shut up or don't complain. Well, guess what, Bill? If you don't like the circumstances, shut up, don't complain. If you don't like the fact that there are other people who feel that what they're getting from Centerlink is not enough, don't complain, Bill. Shut up. Really. It's not that hard. But instead you feel like your opinion is somehow valid, and your opinion is. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. But then you can't back that up with the facts and figures. You can't. You can't back that up with the facts and figures, Bill. You can go on all you like about how, you know, if you've read The Secret, if you affirmate enough, if you pray to God, you can get any job you want. You can move, you can beg, borrow, steal, do whatever you like. But the hard numbers are, Bill, that there are more unemployed people looking for work than there are available jobs. No amount of your, I don't know, fanciful thinking, I really don't know. I mean, honestly, if I didn't know better, I'd say you'd listen to far too much of a few American sort of rah-rah people, because holy shit, dude. You know, this is the sort of thing I expect from a multi-level marketing seminar, which I've been to. You can do it! Nothing can stand in your way! It's impossible! Nothing's impossible, you can do anything! Guess what, Bill? No matter how much I want, how badly I want it, I'm pretty sure I'm never going to be a sexy stripper in a nightclub anywhere. Why? Because I'm not the person they're looking for. I might want to work. It might be a job that's available to me. I can apply all I fucking want. They're not going to apply me for it. I've got the tits for it though, which is fantastic. But beyond that, I'm not the person they want. So the reality of the situation is there are people who are looking for work. They're willing to work. But they are restricted by unfair circumstance that surrounds them, that prevents them from getting a job. Whether it's because they simply don't meet the expectations of the employer, or they don't meet the expectations of the skills required, or the age, or the pay grade, you know, or the physical capabilities of doing it, or the location, or the ability to present well in an interview. You say you suffer from social anxiety, or you have, or you're now on medication. Congratulations, so am I. If you've suffered from social anxiety, Bill, you would know how difficult it is for public speaking. And for most people, going to an interview and talking to a potential employer who is, you know, a potential boss is very intimidating and has a tendency to invoke the same sense of anxiety as public speaking. Lots of people do not test well in interviews for jobs, Bill. Lots of highly skilled people who excel in the workforce do not do well in interviews. Is it their fault that they can't get a job because they can't test well in an interview? I really want to know. Do you think that's their fault? Do you think it would have been your fault if you suffer from an anxiety condition? Should they be told to shut the fuck up, dude? Go do it. Nothing's impossible. I really want to know. I mean, congratulations. You've had anxiety. You've managed to overcome it. You've got job. You've got work. That's fine. That's good. But if you genuinely have anxiety, and sure, you probably do, and I'm not going to disparage you for that, but if you do, you would also know that how you behave in certain social circumstances changes. You may be comfortable talking to someone in a less formal environment, whether it's with friends or your boss or anything, in which case it's easy to build a rapport and to get work and to evoke a sense of who you really are and what you would be like as a potential employee in those circumstances. But you would also know that if I asked you to get up on stage in front of 1,000 people and read your resume out to them, and you really do have social anxiety, you would not leave a very good impression. And I don't blame you for that. I wouldn't either. And I actually played live in a band. I've seen video footage of me singing in front of an audience in a metal band, Bill. It's I would not suggest I was David Lee Roth. Let's put it that way. The point being is, there are things that are outside of an individual's control that through no fault of their own restricts or impedes in some way their capacity or their capability of getting a job. And to suggest that someone in that position, particularly if they become long-term unemployed and the prospects of getting a job become increasingly more distant, because as you've said yourself, it's easy to get a job when you have a job, harder when you don't, and it becomes increasingly harder the longer you're unemployed, then it is extraordinarily, unbelievably ridiculous that you would then suggest that these people do not have a right to voice the fact that they feel like they are struggling under the circumstances they're in. Now, for the life of me, I wasn't planning on talking this long. I actually had half a thought I'd get through this whole thing in about an hour, but from what I understand, and I'll just double check, from what I understand, I've been talking for 3 hours and 19 minutes. We might as well go 3 hours and 20 minutes exact. But do you know what this means, Bill? I mean, you can probably see on the right hand side of this video, I haven't even gone a quarter of the way through this conversation. I really want to know, why do you think the way you do? I really want to know, why do you have the attitude that you do with regards to this situation? Why do you so strongly believe that the welfare of other dependents, whether it's child, whether it's partner, whether it's grandparents, that their welfare is not important in the pursuit of a job? I really want to understand why you think you're somehow entitled to the attitude that you have about being a working taxpayer supporting those on Centerlink, when a lot of those people who are on Centerlink benefits have worked before you, and in some cases worked longer than you, and have contributed far more to the tax system and even your welfare and your assistance in that system. I really want to know that. I want to know if there's anyone out there who wants to comment. Please let me know. If you're older than 40 something and you've worked a lot and you've paid tax and all that sort of stuff, do you feel in any way insulted or offended by the fact that someone like Mr. Amos Here, took that assistance that your tax money paid for schooling and all those sorts of things, took advantage of that, and that's what it's for, but then has the sort of attitude where he can turn around and say, well, fuck you, why should I support you? I really want to know that. If there's anyone out there over the age of 45 who's worked longer than Bill or myself, right, who paid tax, who potentially contributed to that pool of money that helped pay for our schooling, that helped pay for our roads, our access to the benefits that we get in return for tax. I want to know, is there anyone who feels offended by that, by the fact that someone like that is saying, well, you know, now if you don't have a job, fuck you. Why should I care? Why should I contribute or in some way feel that I'm hard done by paying tax for you now to be assisted if you can't get a job locally? If you've experienced drought out here, you've had a farm, you're no longer capable of running a farm, you've found your farm is in contraction, the economy is in contracting with regards to the industry, and there's no money, and you've had to relinquish cattle, you've had to kill cattle, you've had to pass it on or whatever and shut down and do all that sort of stuff. How do you feel about someone like Bill suggesting that, suck it up, buttercup, sell your farm, move where there's fucking work, forget about your family, forget about your friends, forget about any dependents, because it's all about the work, dude. It's all about the work. I really want to know. If there's people out there who have experience, in particular in these rural towns, where non-locals have come in to do the work that potentially is there for locals. They've done the work and then they've left town, contract's finished or whatever. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about that happening? How do you feel about the disparity between 457s working in community housing for the same pay rate as Australians, sending their money overseas, supporting their family and doing all that sort of thing, which is perfectly legitimate and fine, but then suggesting that in some way that is a reflection on Australians if they do not do the same type of work under the same type of conditions, even though their living circumstances are different. I really want to know. I really want to know exactly what you think about this situation. Tell me if I'm off base. Tell me if I'm off base. Tell me if I'm full of shit, I'm talking out my ass, whatever. That's great. That's what I want to hear. I want to hear from people what they think. I want to understand why someone like Bill thinks the way they do. And if you think like Bill, that's great, fantastic. I don't want you to feel attacked. I don't want you to feel offended or upset or anything. I actually genuinely want you to explain to me why you think the way that you do, why you're in agreement with Bill, why you think that it is perfectly reasonable to have this expectation that people should move away in pursuit of a job without any assistance and without any guarantee of work. I want to know that. I want to know, why do you feel that a single mother who may have left a violent relationship, should potentially disregard the welfare and the mental, the self-esteem and mental anxiety that their child may have experienced in pursuit of a job? Because that seems to be the crux of what Bill's saying. Bill is saying that all else comes secondary to a job. All else. Now I want to make it very clear. I'm not an advocate for people who sit on the dole who genuinely do not want to work. I'm not advocating for people to knowingly choose not to participate in any way in trying to work and contribute to society. But I am saying that there are people out there who are unemployed, who through circumstances outside of their control, they either cannot get a job or there are no jobs available to them. These same people have as much value as someone in the workforce. There are people I know who are not working, but they volunteer their time at playgroup, at youth club, at manshed, at town band, at multi-purpose group, at P&F, at the Arts Council. I know this because these are all things that I've participated in while unemployed. These are all things I do. Every day I go to the art house and open up the art gallery, and I sit in the art gallery and I attend the art gallery, and when people come in, you know, I show them stuff, and that's what I do. I don't get paid for it. I do it. I do it because I'm trying to give back. I also do it because, you know, otherwise there's not really anyone else to do it. Unfortunately, those people who are involved with it, they're getting on. They're moving on. They're getting too old to be able to really sit there for hours on end and keep the place open. To the best of my knowledge, I'd be the youngest person there. It's the same as the manshed. I go to the manshed every Tuesday. My dad's a builder. I got two misshapen thumbs. They do not look the same because one's been hit by a hammer so many times that it defies logic. Here's the thing. I'm not crafty. I can't build a square box to save myself. I don't go to the manshed because there's shit I want to build. I don't actually go to the manshed because, you know, I want to turn pens or anything like that. I go to the manshed to help. I go to the manshed to support these older gentlemen who go there. I make bread every Tuesday. I make that for myself, but also make it to take it down there because that's something that I enjoy doing. But I do it. I go to the manshed. I don't have to. I could stay at home and do nothing. I could binge watch anything on you know, YouTube or whatever. It doesn't matter, right? But I do. I go. I do it for myself, certainly because, I mean, I obviously, to some extent, I enjoy it, you know, and I feel good about doing so. But the point is to lump all these people into the same thing, and then to suggest that I don't have the right to say I'm struggling on Centerlink. I'm not getting that I find it difficult to deal with day-to-day expenses with what I'm getting paid. Really shows a level of disrespect that borders on disbelief for me. And I also think it shows that there is a lack of understanding that if you look at facts and figures, Newstart is a set amount that's paid depending on your dependents and such, and it's a set amount. It's whatever it is. It's $400 or $500 a fortnight, right? That's what you get paid as a single person, no dependents. That's Australia-wide. Now you go to the city, rent costs more, but food is cheaper. Petrol's cheaper. You know, there's public transport. You come out here, rural areas. Rent typically is cheaper, although not as cheap as you would think. But food is much more expensive. Petrol's much more expensive. We have less competition for power supply or internet or any of that sort of stuff. So of course, you know, we pay a premium for internet out here. We pay a premium for power out here because we don't have a choice. We don't have any competitors to be able to dictate the market. We also don't have the luxury of the level of public transport that you do. Now sure, once you're small enough you could walk from one town to the other, one end of town to the other. And I have. I mean, it takes some time, but you can do it. But what about someone who has limited mobility? What about someone who is perfectly capable of working, but walking that sort of distance to and from work would severely limit their capacity for work? I mean, they could sit behind a desk, they could do data entry, they could do any of those sorts of things, but walking to and from work, you know, that could be debilitating for some people. Does that mean they're on a disability pension? No. Disability pension is put in place for quite severe conditions, for conditions that impinge upon your capability of doing work. But, you know, Someone can still do data entry and have difficulty walking around. I know several people here who have trouble with mobility, and some of them even younger than me. Right? Like I said, it's like me and my back. Physically, I look like I need as much heavy labour work as possible because, quite frankly, I'm soft in the middle. Right? And I don't look like I'm, physically disabled in some way. That I've been. It doesn't look like my back is injured. But you know what? I can work. I'm willing to work. I want to work, and I have worked. I have worked my whole life. I've experienced long-term unemployment at times too, but I have worked my whole life. At no time have I sat down and said, nah, I've had enough. I'm not going to fucking work anymore. I'm still looking for work now. I've applied for work here so many times in such a small place that at this point I've actually taken some of the paperwork and literally scanned it into my computer with the application, scanned it into my computer, filled it out, and then every time I want to hand it in, I just print it out and date it because I'm just writing the same shit again and again and again, right? Now, look, I don't begrudge anyone in town for why I haven't got a job. There's other people looking for work. There's people younger than me looking for work. There are people in worse situations than I am looking for work. There are people who have higher demands on their income than I do. There are people who, who have to look after infirmed loved ones. They need to work more than I do. Does that mean I don't want to work? No. Does that mean if that job wasn't there and I wasn't successful, I wouldn't appreciate it? Of course, I want that job as much as anyone else. It doesn't mean I blame anyone, though, that I don't get that job. I understand the reality of the situation. Employers are looking for who they want to fill that job. I don't necessarily fit that bill. I can bitch and moan and complain all I want about the fact that I can't get certain jobs because I don't fit the expectation that that employer has. They want someone who's young, who's attractive, probably female, and probably with a better set of tits than I do have. It's unfair. It is unfair. But it's the reality of things. And I know from being an employer myself, from owning businesses, from coaching businesses, that is unfortunately the nature of business. And it is it's an aspect of the process. You can't discriminate against anyone. That's true. And you shouldn't discriminate against anyone. But that nonetheless does not mean that an employer doesn't have certain preferences for certain people for certain jobs. It's because they have an expectation that they want met. And those expectations, for right or for wrong, exist even if they're through prejudice. The idea that, a young, hot, blonde, female woman is going to draw more people into the shop to buy more product. It's a prejudice against anyone who doesn't fit that mold. But, it exists for a reason, regardless of whether it's factually true or not. That's how people feel. That's why they aim for that sort of person. Same reason that a lot of employers, they have a tendency to shy away from people who are getting on in more senior years because they feel in some way that they can't compete physically with younger people. They may have the experience, they may have the knowledge, they may even have the dedication for the job. But there is a concern there that employers can have that they're physically not up to the demands of the tasks and that there is a higher potential and a higher risk for injury. It's not fair. As I said, there are at least 3 people I can think of off the top of my head at the man shed I'm pretty sure are fitter than I am. I'm pretty sure that they would be stronger than I am. I'm pretty sure that they have more endurance than I do. And I would, knowing them, I would not hesitate to ask them to help in a particular, type of work in a heartbeat. Because I know that they would be all over it like flies on shit. But that doesn't stop the fact that as someone who doesn't know these people intimately, known them for a long time, or got to know them much better as people, or seen them actually working, you would make the assumption, given their age, which is quite visible, that they simply would not be up to the demands of the type of work. It's not fair, but it is reality. And that's what I want to get out of this conversation. That's what I want to work out, and that's what I want to hear from anyone who cares to comment on this video. I want to know, where does reality begin? What are the expectations, and where's the gap? Because to me, the expectations that Mr. Amos here is placing upon other people is completely at odds with the reality of the situation. But that is just my opinion. That's, that's from my experience. I'm not saying I necessarily have it right. But I want to know, is that really how you feel? Do you really think that what Bill is saying is reasonable? Valid? Am I missing something? Is there a way that it can be broken down, explained to me in more pragmatic terms, or in a different way that will help me to understand why is this entrenched thinking there, that Bill thinks that, all these things he said, they're right, they're valid, right? As I said, I'm not interested in attacking anyone. I'm not interested in browbeating anyone. I genuinely want to know, because I have read, and it's not just this conversation, I've read some of the other comments on this particular poll, and there are some people's attitudes and opinions and impressions that I simply don't quite understand. Now, I know that's born out from experience, and that's the point. I want to know from your experience, in a way that I can understand, why do you feel the way you do? Because, I see people sitting there commenting on the photo that, oh, that lady, she's got a takeaway coffee. Yeah, she's under duress. Ha, ha, ha. Guess what? The way that I've managed to maintain the welfare of my daughter, especially when I was still paying off a car loan, is by doing intermittent fasting. Personally, I only ate every second day. I did that to safeguard and make sure that my daughter had enough good, healthy food for herself. And you know what? When I got paid from Centerlink, I would take my daughter down to the bakery. I would buy myself a takeaway coffee. Cost $5. Merino coffee too. It's nice coffee. And I would buy my daughter a donut and a slushie. Does that mean I'm abusing Centerlink? Because I really want to know. Because I tell you what, I ate 7 days out of 14 to be able to sit down and enjoy a cup of coffee and a donut with my daughter every fortnight. She liked going to Merino Bakery. She likes having a donut. She likes having a slushie. And it seemed like a good way to maintain a high level of mental health, not just for her, but for me. Because it can grind you down, being subject to the type of austerity that people expect from you when you're living on assisted payments. I mean, it's really odd. I mean, I understand if I was buying lobster every second week and people were saying, oh my God, you're eating lobster. And, oh really? You're eating green prawns? Holy shit, yeah, okay. Fine. Clearly, I have too much money from Centerlink. But to suggest that a $5 takeaway cup of coffee is some screaming red flag for abuse of the system, it really sort of misses me, because you don't know if that person has spent the other 13 days of that fortnight at home eating 2-minute noodles, eating peanut butter sandwiches, doing whatever it needs to take. And the one time that they have to go out and go and see Centerlink to take public transport if they need, or to drive a car, to spend the fuel, to go and engage with Centerlink, or to go out and go shopping or anything. They choose to spend $5 on a cup of coffee to elevate their mental state, to bring some sort of reprieve to their everyday life. Is that really that, is it really that disgusting? I mean, I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. Sure, there probably is people out there, and no doubt there is. There'd be people out there who, sure, they probably have more money than they need from Centerlink, and they're blowing it on takeaway coffee and Christ knows what. Whatever. But that does not mean because you see someone who has a takeaway coffee in their hand, who's unemployed, that you should immediately leap to this conclusion that they're abusing the system. It makes no sense to me. But I want to know. Tell me. Explain to me. Put it down in the comments. Break it down for me. Do you really think that, do you really think that that is an abuse of the system? Do you think that it's not that I shouldn't get a takeaway coffee once a fortnight and a donut and a slushie for my daughter, despite the fact that over that fortnight I personally have only eaten 7 days out of those 14 to make sure that my daughter has enough good healthy food for herself? I mean, also, I make no bones about it, I've also done it for other reasons, but that's certainly a big part of it. Because when I was paying off my car, and still paying off my car loan, when unfortunately my boss went bankrupt last, there was not a lot of money left. There really wasn't. And given the fact that I was 3 to 4 years through a 5-year car loan, I did not see the value in losing that car because I couldn't pay the loan. So yeah, I kept paying the loan. I had to make concessions in other places. I don't have Netflix. I don't have, fancy clothes or anything else. We rely upon, op shops and the like for a lot of things. I've learnt to cook stews and various things to help money get by. I've learned to buy in bulk and put it in a deep freezer and try to stretch food as much as I can. As I said, intermittent fasting every second day. Initially for my own self-discipline, also because I meditate and I engage in some of that lifestyle. But part of it was that, and part of it was also so that I could safeguard, so that I knew that I had an abundance of good, healthy food for my daughter, regardless if something happened, regardless if a Centerlink payment was late, or there was a random bill that came in, or the power bill was a little higher than usual, or rego was due, or anything like that. I still had enough there. But I wouldn't have been able to do that unless I fasted every second day, especially when I was paying the car loan off. Now, I'm no longer paying the car loan off. Oh, I tell you what, I'm probably living the best life I've had in a few years. Now, does that mean that it wouldn't improve with a job? Sure. I'm after a job, let's get a job, fantastic. But you have to understand there are circumstances where people sometimes have to make decisions that may not make sense to you because they're in circumstances that you are not in and have never been in and do not understand what they are going through. Now, I've gathered I can talk a lot. So, we're looking at 3 hours and 46 minutes. So, I think at this point, I'm going to stop. I'm going to keep going on with this. I'm going to make some more videos. I want to finish this conversation. I want to finish what's written here because I think there's some very important points that Bill brings up. And I genuinely want to understand why he feels the way he feels. Now, as I said, it's not a personal attack, and I don't want anyone to look at attacking Bill or anyone else over this. I just want to try and understand. Because quite frankly, I mean, at this point, Bill has unfriended me on Facebook, and you know, I don't care. Don't really see that as much of a loss. But you know, that's not what it's about. I just want to understand. I want to understand as much as I can about everyone's prevailing opinion about this situation. If you have made it through this much of the video, holy shit. Thank you, and sorry for the odd expletive. Expletive? I didn't even say that right. For the odd bad word. But anyway, I'm going to leave it here. It's very late here, and I will probably make another video tomorrow if I remember. Anyway, thanks again.